When my son told me he got married, it was not through a phone call. It was not through an invitation sealed in a crisp white envelope. It was a digital afterthought. 3 days later, his new wife called me. She did not call to ask for my blessing. She did not call to apologize for the secret ceremony. She called to aggressively demand the $800 rent transfer I had sent my son every single month for 2 straight years. I told her the account was permanently closed. She panicked. She threatened me. She did not realize I had spent 30 years shaping molten steel, and my resolve was much harder than her empty, entitled threats. My name is Tobias. I am 69 years old. I am an African-American widower, and somehow I am still fighting battles my family forces upon me. As a retired foreman, I thought I had escaped the toxicity of managing ungrateful people, but the worst betrayal came from my own blood. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family members who severely underestimated your strength and your worth. My house in Southside Chicago used to be a sanctuary filled with warmth and noise. My late wife Diane had a vibrant laugh that could shatter the thickest, heaviest silence. Since she passed away 5 years ago from a sudden stroke, the house has been quiet. I filled that profound quiet by maintaining my routine. I woke up early, drank black coffee, and managed my modest investments. On a typical Sunday morning, I sat in my favorite armchair. The screen of my phone glowed against the dim light of my living room. I saw a notification pop up. A distant cousin from Ohio had tagged my only son Jared in a photograph. I tapped the screen. The image loaded and my chest tightened with a sharp, sudden physical ache. Jared was wearing a custom-tailored black tuxedo. He stood under an elaborate, expensive floral archway. Next to him stood a white woman named Megan. She wore a pristine designer white wedding gown. They were holding up crystal champagne flutes, surrounded entirely by her family. Her parents beamed with intense pride in the background of the photo. I looked closely at the timestamp on the post. The wedding took place yesterday afternoon. I am his father. I paid his full college tuition without ever asking for a dime in return. I bailed him out of multiple financial disasters when he overspent on luxury cars and expensive vacations. Yet I found out about the most important day of his life through a stranger's digital post on social media. There was no phone call leading up to the event. There was no invitation lost in the mail. There was just a deliberate, highly calculated exclusion. They had completely erased me from the narrative of his life. I did not throw the phone against the wall. I did not scream, and I did not shed a single tear. 30 years working as a foreman at the local steel mill taught me exactly how to temper extreme heat and pressure. You do not react to a fire by throwing more fire on it. You contain the blaze. You mold it. You let the metal cool until it hardens into something absolutely unbreakable. I placed the phone gently on the kitchen counter. I walked out the back door and stepped down into my garage. The air smelled of fresh sawdust and old motor oil. This space was my true sanctuary. I walked over to a shattered wooden dining chair resting on my heavy workbench. Diane had bought that specific chair at a local flea market 30 years ago. Jared had broken it a month prior when he visited my house to ask for another significant cash loan. He kicked it in a fit of sudden rage when I told him he needed to budget his money better instead of relying on my retirement funds. I picked up a heavy block of sandpaper. I started sanding the jagged, broken splinters. The repetitive physical motion grounded my chaotic thoughts. Every stroke of the rough paper against the damaged wood was a physical release of my deep disappointment. Jared had always been incredibly weak when it came to standing up for himself or taking accountability. Diane always warned me that my constant financial rescuing would eventually create an entitled monster. She repeatedly told me I was buffering him from the harsh reality of the adult world. She was entirely correct. I sanded the wood until the surface was perfectly smooth to the touch. I realized in that quiet moment that my son viewed me exactly as he viewed this broken chair. I was an object. I was a convenient tool to be used broken and quickly discarded when it no longer served his immediate financial needs. I spent the next 2 days in total unbroken silence. I did not call Jared to demand an explanation for the wedding. I let the silence stretch out, knowing his inherent greed would eventually force his hand. Exactly 3 days after the secret wedding ceremony, my phone rang loudly in the kitchen. The caller ID displayed Jared's name. I wiped the fine wood dust from my hands with a rag and answered the call. It was not Jared, it was Megan. Her voice carried a sharp, arrogant tone that immediately set my teeth on edge. Tobias, the rent transfer did not process this morning, she stated bluntly. There was no polite greeting. There was no mention of the wedding. There was absolutely no apology for excluding me from the ceremony. She bypassed basic human decency and went straight for my wallet. The landlord is already emailing us with late fees. Did you forget to authorize the $800 transfer? She demanded aggressively. I stood perfectly still, gripping the freshly sanded chair leg. The sheer audacity of her demand was staggering to comprehend. I had subsidized Jared's expensive rent for 24 consecutive months because he claimed his marketing job did not pay enough to cover living expenses. I had generously continued the payments even after he moved into a luxury apartment with Megan. She genuinely believed she was entitled to my hard-earned pension. I took a deep, steadying breath. I did not forget anything, I replied with absolute chilling calm. The transfer did not process because that specific bank account has been permanently closed. The silence on the other end of the line was heavy and thick. I could hear her rapid, angry breathing. Then her massive entitlement shattered her fake composure entirely. Closed, Megan screeched, her voice pitching into a hysterical, piercing frequency. You cannot just close the account without warning us first. We rely on that specific money to maintain our current lifestyle. What is wrong with your brain? I did not raise my voice a single decibel. I spoke with the practiced authority of a man who managed 100 tough union workers. You rely on my money while deliberately excluding me from my only son's wedding, I stated clearly and factually. You do not respect me as a father or a man. You simply respect my bank account. The funding is officially terminated. Megan lost her temper completely. Her words became vicious, targeted daggers. You are just a bitter, broke old man, she spat viciously through the phone speaker. You have nothing else to offer anyone. You are going to die completely alone in that rundown house. I heard a sudden scuffle in the background. Jared violently grabbed the phone from her hand. His voice was frantic, panicked, and highly aggressive. Dad, you need to listen to me right now, Jared screamed loudly. You are clearly suffering from a severe mental breakdown. If your mind is failing you, I will personally have you declared legally incompetent and put in a state-run facility. Transfer the money immediately, or I swear to God I will take legal control of everything you own. He did not wait for my response. He angrily hung up the phone. The dead dial tone echoed in the quiet space of my kitchen. I lowered the phone slowly. My own son had just threatened to strip away my freedom, my mind, and my assets over $800. The initial grief vanished instantly. A cold metallic resolve took its place entirely. Jared had officially declared war. He believed I was a vulnerable, declining old man. He severely underestimated the intellect and the resources of a man who had built his entire life from scratch. I walked over to the front door and locked the deadbolt. The heavy brass deadbolt slid into place with a satisfying final click. I did not move from the entryway. 30 years at the steel mill taught me that a sudden shift in atmospheric pressure always precedes a violent explosion. The explosion arrived exactly 45 minutes later. Heavy tires crunched aggressively against the gravel of my driveway. Car doors slammed with forceful, angry echoes. I stood in the deep shadow of my hallway and watched through the frosted glass pane. Jared and Megan marched up my front walkway. They moved with the frantic, uncoordinated energy of people whose bank accounts had just hit zero. They did not ring the doorbell. Megan pounded her fist against the solid oak door. I waited for the third series of heavy knocks before I turned the lock and pulled the door open. I did not invite them inside. I stood squarely in the threshold. Jared looked terrible. He was sweating despite the crisp afternoon air. He completely refused to look me directly in the eye. Megan, however, possessed an alarming level of synthetic confidence. She wore a tailored beige trench coat and a smile that lacked any genuine human warmth. Her posture radiated pure entitlement. "Tobias, thank God you are home," Megan said loudly. She immediately attempted to push past me into the foyer. I simply shifted my weight, blocking her path completely. My unyielding silence forced her to stop on the welcome mat. "We are incredibly worried about you," she continued. Her voice dripped with calculated fake sympathy. "Jared and I discussed your phone call on the way over. Closing your bank account and abruptly cutting off your own son makes no rational sense. It is completely out of character for you to act this vindictively. We believe you are experiencing severe cognitive decline. We need to get you checked out by a proper physician." The audacity of her words was breathtaking. She was attempting to gaslight a perfectly healthy man on his own front porch. She wanted to frame my financial boundary as a medical emergency. I looked at my son. Jared shifted his weight nervously from one foot to the other. He stared down at his expensive Italian leather shoes. He allowed his new wife to insult my sanity without offering a single word of defense. I recalled a specific evening exactly 10 years ago. My late wife Diane sat at the kitchen table reviewing Jared's credit card statements. Jared had maxed out 3 separate accounts on luxury vacations while claiming he needed money for rent. Diane had looked at me with deep exhaustion in her beautiful brown eyes. She warned me that clearing his debts was not parenting. She stated clearly that my constant financial rescue missions were building a cage of permanent entitlement around him. Diane knew my guilt over working double shifts at the mill made me overcompensate with cash. I wanted to give my son the comfortable life I never had growing up. I ignored her warning back then. I was looking at the monstrous result of my own leniency right now. Jared was a weak man hiding behind a ruthless woman. "I am in perfect health, Megan," I stated calmly. My voice carried the same low, authoritative frequency I used to break up dangerous fights between furious steelworkers on the factory floor. My mind has never been sharper. Closing a bank account is a strictly financial decision. It is not a medical crisis. You are simply angry because your free ride has ended. Megan dropped the sympathetic act instantly. Her jaw tightened. The fake smile vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating glare. Her eyes darted over my shoulder, scanning the interior of my house. She spotted the small brass bowl resting on the hallway console table. That bowl held my spare house keys. "You are not thinking clearly, Tobias," Megan snapped. Her voice rose into a shrill, demanding pitch. "You are living alone in a massive house. You are isolating yourself from your family. We need a spare key right now. We need full access to monitor your condition. You cannot manage your own affairs anymore." Jared finally found his voice. It was weak and trembling with poorly disguised panic. "Dad, just give us the spare key. We are trying to protect you. You are acting completely irrational. If you fall or have an accident, we need a reliable way to get inside the house." He repeated the exact lines Megan had clearly rehearsed with him during their frantic drive over. He was a pathetic parrot repeating a highly dangerous script. I felt a profound wave of absolute disgust. They did not care about my physical safety. They cared exclusively about securing unrestricted access to the property. They wanted a key to rifle through my documents, assess my valuables, and completely hijack my life. They wanted to strip away my independence under the guise of family concern. "You are never getting a key to my house," I said. "You do not have my permission to be on this property. You showed your true colors when you chose to hide your wedding from me. You made your choice to exclude me from your life. You are now adults who must survive without my pension paying your monthly bills. Diane always told me that overindulging you would eventually poison your character, Jared. She saw the greed taking deep root in your soul. I refused to see it until today. You are a massive disappointment." Jared flinched sharply at the mention of his mother. He took a physical step backward, his face flushing with sudden shame. Megan did exactly the opposite. The realization that she was losing complete control over her primary funding source triggered a visceral, aggressive reaction. She lunged forward. She tried to violently bypass my shoulder to reach the hallway table. She stretched her arm out, her manicured fingers clawing desperately toward the brass bowl containing the keys. Her sheer audacity broke every single boundary of basic respect. She believed she could physically overpower me in my own home. I did not shout. I did not strike her. I simply planted my heavy boots, shifted my shoulder to abruptly block her momentum, and shoved her backward out of the doorframe using only the leverage of my body weight. She stumbled clumsily, her expensive high heels catching on the welcome mat. Jared caught her by the elbows before she hit the wooden porch railing. He looked at me with a mixture of profound shock and sheer panic. "You cannot treat us like this," Megan shrieked. Her face was flushed with absolute unhinged rage. "You are out of your mind. We will force you out of this house." "Do not ever attempt to force your way into my home again," I said with lethal calmness. "Get off my property." I grabbed the heavy brass handle of the solid oak door. I slammed it shut in their faces with a brutal force that rattled the front window panes. I instantly turned the deadbolt. I stood alone in the silent hallway, deliberately regulating my breathing. The confrontation was entirely physical, but the true threat was psychological and legal. They were rapidly building a false narrative. They were actively attempting to establish a fake reality where I was a violent, confused old man in desperate need of institutional supervision. I knew exactly what they were doing. I walked quietly into my front study. I kept the overhead lights off and stood beside the heavy velvet curtains. I peeled back a tiny fraction of the fabric to observe the driveway without being seen. Jared and Megan were arguing violently on my front lawn. Jared was pacing back and forth, waving his hands in the air in total frustration. Megan stood perfectly still, her face twisted in a vicious scowl. She unzipped her oversized leather tote bag. She pulled out a thick, legal-sized manila folder. She shoved the folder forcefully directly into Jared's chest, pointing a commanding finger at my front door. Even from the distance of the study window, my eyesight caught the bold black lettering printed across the front label. It read, "Emergency Guardianship Petition." The financial extortion phase was officially over. The brutal legal warfare had begun. The heavy manila folder in Jared's hands signaled a severe, undeniable escalation. An emergency guardianship petition was not a casual, angry threat thrown around in a heated moment. It was a highly calculated legal strike aimed directly at my personal autonomy and my fundamental civil rights. I stepped away from the velvet curtains and let the thick fabric fall perfectly back into place against the window frame. I needed to secure the physical perimeter of my house immediately before addressing the legal warfare. My current locks were standard brass fixtures installed over a decade ago when the neighborhood felt entirely safe. They were no longer sufficient against an enemy who intimately knew the layout of my property and possessed a deep, desperate greed. I grabbed my car keys from the kitchen counter and drove directly to the independent hardware store located 3 miles down the main road. The crisp, biting afternoon air did absolutely nothing to cool the simmering heat expanding in my chest. I walked through the sliding glass doors of the hardware store with singular, unwavering focus. The owner, an older man named Marcus, who had reliably supplied heavy tools to my steel mill unit 20 years ago, greeted me with a firm, silent nod. He instantly recognized the hardened, unforgiving look in my eyes. I did not engage in any polite small talk. I asked immediately for 3 industrial-grade deadbolts, specifically the heavy models utilized for commercial steel security doors. Marcus did not ask any unnecessary questions about my sudden need for extreme security. He retreated to the back stockroom and retrieved the heavy brass mechanisms in silence. I paid in cash, feeling the cold, reassuring weight of the solid metal boxes in my hands. These massive locks would require drilling entirely new, wider holes into my solid oak doors, a rigorous physical task I genuinely welcomed. Hard physical labor had always been my primary method of processing chaotic, highly emotional situations. I drove back to my house with a precise step-by-step installation plan already perfectly mapped out in my mind. I pulled into my driveway exactly 45 minutes after I had originally departed. The exterior of the house looked entirely unchanged from the street. The front door was completely closed and seemingly secure. I unlocked the standard deadbolt and stepped into the main foyer. Instantly, the atmosphere inside the house felt fundamentally wrong. 30 demanding years of managing highly hazardous industrial environments had honed my survival instincts to a razor-sharp edge. You learn very quickly how to sense when the air pressure subtly shifts in a closed room, indicating a dangerous chemical leak or a compromised structural beam. My house currently felt similarly compromised. The air felt stale and disrupted by recent hurried movement. I placed the heavy hardware bag carefully on the kitchen island and walked silently down the carpeted hallway. I stopped abruptly in the doorway of my private home office. This specific room was my absolute sanctuary within the house. It was the quiet space where I managed my complex investments, read my extensive collection of history books, and preserved the quiet, sacred memories of my life with Diane. The violation of this space was immediately apparent to my highly trained eye. The heavy mahogany leather chair was pushed out from the desk at an awkward, uneven angle. The middle drawer of my vintage wooden desk was pulled open exactly half an inch, exposing the organized pens inside. I walked over to the tall steel filing cabinet resting in the far corner of the room. I always kept this specific cabinet secured with a small, customized brass padlock. The lock was currently hanging completely open, the metallic clasp entirely unsecured against the steel handle. Someone had physically breached my private sanctuary. Someone had touched my most sensitive, confidential documents. I did not shout out in anger. I did not panic or lose my composure. I did not touch a single surface in the room to preserve the scene. I simply turned around and walked directly back to the kitchen to execute my silent countermeasure. 7 years ago, a brief, violent surge of aggressive burglaries had swept through our normally quiet suburban neighborhood. Houses were systematically stripped of valuables while terrified families slept upstairs. Diane had been profoundly terrified by the constant news reports. To permanently ease her mind, I spent a grueling, exhausting weekend installing a state-of-the-art covert security system throughout the entire property. I meticulously placed high-definition microcameras inside the smoke detectors behind the hallway ventilation grates and tucked deeply into the dark corners of the wooden crown molding. The complex wiring was completely invisible, routed expertly through the thick interior walls. I never once mentioned the hidden cameras to Jared. He was away at a distant college at the time, and he possessed a highly anxious, paranoid disposition. I knew telling him about the constant surveillance would only cause unnecessary drama and panic. I simply maintained the system in total secrecy, quietly updating the secure cloud servers every single year. I pulled out my heavily encrypted laptop from a hidden floor safe and logged directly into the secure local network. I pulled up the chronological timeline for the exact 45 minutes I had been absent from the property. The digital playback loaded instantly on my high-resolution screen. I watched the front porch exterior camera feed. Exactly 5 minutes after my vehicle backed out of the driveway, Jared walked cautiously up to the front porch steps. He looked nervously over his shoulder with the jerky, erratic movements of a deeply guilty man. He knelt quickly beside the large, decorative limestone rock positioned near the blooming azalea bushes. Diane had hidden a spare emergency key under that exact rock 12 years ago. I had completely forgotten about its existence. Jared retrieved the rusty brass key and slid it quickly into the front door lock. He turned the mechanism and pushed the heavy door open. He stepped aside, waving his hand frantically toward the street. Megan jogged quickly up the concrete driveway and slipped silently inside my home. They were operating with the swift, practiced coordination of professional thieves invading a target. I switched the live video feed directly to the interior hallway camera. I watched my only biological son lead his aggressively entitled new wife directly into my private home office. I switched to the main office feed to observe their actions. The covert audio recording was crystal clear. Megan immediately began barking sharp, urgent, commanding orders at her husband. She commanded Jared to rapidly search the desk drawers while she aggressively tackled the tall steel filing cabinet. She demanded he find the specific key to the hanging padlock. Jared frantically searched my organized desk, his hands shaking violently as he tossed my expensive pens and personal stationery carelessly aside. He eventually found the small brass key hidden cleverly inside a vintage wooden cigar box. He tossed it nervously to Megan. She unlocked the heavy cabinet with a triumphant, deeply malicious smirk spreading across her face. She began pulling out thick stacks of confidential manila folders. She dumped my private financial life carelessly onto the polished mahogany desk. "Take clear pictures of absolutely everything with a $sign on it," Megan ordered sharply. "We need total, undeniable leverage for the upcoming guardianship hearing. The judge needs to see exactly what his hidden assets are worth so we can petition for immediate legal control." Jared obediently pulled out his expensive smartphone. He hovered nervously over the desk, snapping dozens of high-resolution photographs of my monthly bank statements, my utility bills, and my previous tax returns. He moved with cowardly, pathetic obedience, entirely subservient to a woman who was actively orchestrating the total destruction of his own father. I watched my own flesh and blood systematically betray every single principle of honor and respect I had ever tried to teach him. He was willingly trading his familial loyalty for a false sense of temporary financial security. I felt the very last remaining thread of paternal leniency snap and dissolve into complete nothingness. The nervous, sweating man on the screen was no longer my son. He was a hostile operative attempting to dismantle my life. I leaned much closer to the bright laptop screen, pausing the high-definition video feed to carefully analyze the exact documents they were photographing. I zoomed in tightly on the glossy white paper resting on the dark wood of the desk. A cold, sharp, predatory smile formed slowly on my face. The specific statement Jared was frantically capturing belonged to my secondary local checking account. It was the mundane account I used strictly for minor household expenses and weekly groceries. It currently held a very meager, unimpressive balance. Furthermore, the printed statement was exactly 3 years out of date. They were completely bypassing the encrypted digital ledgers. They had absolutely zero knowledge of the massive, highly lucrative offshore investment portfolios I had meticulously built and guarded over 3 decades. They genuinely believed I was a simple, easily manipulated retired foreman surviving on a standard monthly pension. Their profound ignorance was their greatest, most fatal vulnerability. I pressed play to continue watching the distressing footage. Megan suddenly gasped loudly, breaking the silence of the office. She violently shoved Jared aside and snatched a specific thick document from the very bottom of a hidden blue folder. She held the heavy cream-colored paper up to the overhead light, her eyes widening with a terrifying, all-consuming greed. "Jared, look at this right now," she breathed heavily, tapping the thick paper aggressively with her manicured fingernail. "This is not just a standard residential house deed. This is prime commercial real estate." I recognized the legal document instantly. It was the absolute unencumbered deed to a highly valuable commercial property located directly in the center of the thriving downtown business district. I had purchased that prime real estate 20 years ago when the entire area was completely desolate and abandoned. It was now worth a massive small fortune. Megan held the deed up to Jared's phone camera, ensuring every single legal seal and notarized signature was perfectly captured in the frame. She looked at her trembling husband with a terrifying, victorious, and utterly ruthless grin. "This specific building is our absolute ticket out of this suffocating debt," she declared viciously. "When we get the medical guardianship fully approved by the judge, this downtown property is the very first thing we liquidate for cash." I calmly closed the laptop screen. The soft mechanical click echoed loudly in the silent kitchen. They had swallowed the bait completely. They had officially selected their high-value target. They were preparing to steal a building they did not realize was heavily fortified by impenetrable corporate trust laws. The family war was no longer just about establishing boundaries. It was about absolute, irreversible financial annihilation. The morning sun had barely crested the Chicago skyline when my phone shattered the quiet of the kitchen. I was sitting at the small oak table drinking black coffee, mentally reviewing the footage from the previous afternoon. Jared and Megan had invaded my sanctuary, violated my privacy, and set their sights on a downtown property they knew nothing about. I expected a protracted legal battle over guardianship. I did not expect them to escalate to outright theft within 24 hours. The harsh electronic chime of my phone signaled an automated alert. I picked up the device and read the urgent text message from First National Bank. It was a high-priority fraud notification. An unknown party was actively attempting to initiate a wire transfer of exactly $30,000 from my secondary savings account. It was the very same account they had photographed in my office. They had seen a modest balance and decided to drain it completely dry before bothering with a judge. The sheer arrogance of the maneuver was astonishing. They assumed I was too old or confused to monitor my financial assets. I finished my coffee, grabbed my coat, and walked out the door. The air was frigid, but my mind was a furnace. I drove down the familiar streets toward the main branch of First National Bank. $30,000 was a massive sum to simply wire without authorization. They had to have presented physical documentation to bypass standard security protocols. During my 30 years at the steel mill, I authorized thousands of equipment purchases and payroll checks. Someone had to sign for this money, and that someone was absolutely not me. I walked through the heavy glass doors of the bank with purposeful, measured steps. I bypassed the standard line and walked directly to the glass-walled office of the branch manager, David Harrison. David was a meticulous man who had managed my local accounts for over 15 years. When he saw me standing in his doorway, his face drained of all color. He looked like a man who had just realized he made a fatal administrative error. I stepped into his office and shut the heavy door firmly behind me. I sat down in the leather chair opposite his desk. "David, someone attempted to wire $30,000 from my secondary savings account this morning," I stated with absolute clarity. "Explain to me exactly how an unauthorized party initiated a transfer of that magnitude." David swallowed hard. He adjusted his glasses nervously, refusing to meet my steady gaze. He opened his desk drawer, pulled out a thick, legally stamped document, and pushed it slowly across the polished mahogany surface toward me. "Tobias, I am incredibly sorry," David said, his voice lacking its usual confidence. "Your son Jared came in right when we opened the doors at 8 o'clock. He presented a fully notarized power of attorney. He claimed your health had taken a sudden severe downturn overnight. He stated he needed immediate access to liquid funds to secure a place for you in a specialized medical care facility. The document looked entirely legitimate. It had a state seal and your direct signature." I picked up the heavy paper. I did not need a forensic expert to tell me it was fraudulent. The document granted Jared total unrestricted control over my medical and financial decisions. I ignored the dense legal jargon and looked directly at the bottom of the final page. The signature was a pathetic, sloppy imitation of my handwriting. During my decades managing the mill floor, I developed a specific, aggressive signature. I always crossed my T with a sharp, heavy slash that tore slightly into the paper. This signature was soft, hesitant, and completely lacked the physical pressure I apply to a pen. Jared had traced it, likely copying a discarded receipt. I placed the fraudulent document back onto the desk. I looked directly into David's eyes, making sure he saw the terrifying clarity in my gaze. "David, you have known me for 15 years, I said calmly. "Do I look like a man suffering from a sudden cognitive collapse?" David shook his head quickly. "No, Tobias. You look perfectly fine. I should have called you directly to verify the document." Jared was just so frantic, so convincing. He brought his wife with him. She was crying in the lobby, talking loudly about how much pain you were in. They created an incredible scene of panic. The manipulation was masterful but incredibly reckless. Megan had used fake tears to distract the bank staff while Jared pushed the forged paperwork across the counter. They had weaponized my non-existent illness to commit a major financial crime. "The signature is an absolute forgery," I stated firmly. "I have never signed a power of attorney. I am in total control of my faculties. You will flag that document as fraudulent immediately. You will permanently freeze that secondary savings account. No funds will move in or out without my physical presence and my thumbprint." David nodded rapidly, his fingers flying across his computer keyboard to execute my exact commands. He was visibly sweating, terrified of the massive legal liability the bank now faced for almost processing a fraudulent wire. He locked the account down with an unyielding administrative freeze. The $30,000 was entirely safe. "The transfer is completely blocked, Tobias," David said, wiping his forehead. "The account is locked. I will personally inform our internal fraud department about the forged power of attorney." "Before you do that, David, I need to know one specific detail," I demanded softly. "Where exactly was my money going?" Jared claimed he needed it for a specialized medical facility. "I want to see the destination routing number." David hesitated for a fraction of a second. Bank privacy protocols dictated discretion, but he knew he was already on incredibly dangerous ground. He clicked his mouse a few times and printed a single sheet of paper. He handed it to me with a grim, deeply concerned expression. "This is the destination ledger for the blocked wire," David explained quietly. "It was not routed to any hospital, clinic, or state medical facility. The routing number belongs to a commercial account." I looked down at the printed ledger. My eyes scanned the black ink, absorbing the shocking reality of my son's desperation. The $30,000 was not intended for my supposed medical care. It was not intended for Jared's personal bank account. The money was being wired directly to an entity called Apex Capital Solutions. I knew exactly what kind of business operated under names like that. It was a high-risk, predatory private loan company. It was the kind of shadow institution that charged astronomical, illegal interest rates and aggressively pursued debtors who defaulted. I read the secondary line on the ledger, and the entire puzzle snapped violently into place. The primary debtor associated with that specific account number was Megan Whitmore. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. Jared was not stealing my money to fund a lavish lifestyle or to pay his own rent. My son had just committed federal wire fraud. He had forged a legal document and lied to a bank manager to steal $30,000 of my hard-earned money. He was risking a lengthy prison sentence in a federal penitentiary for one single reason. He was desperately trying to pay off his new wife's massive, dangerous, and predatory debts. Megan had not married Jared because she loved him. She had married him because she believed he had a rich, easily manipulated father who could act as her personal bailout fund. The emergency guardianship petition was not a medical precaution. It was a frantic criminal race to steal my assets before her own financial predators came to collect. The trap they set for me had just become a noose around their own necks. I walked out of First National Bank with the freezing winter wind biting sharply against my face, but my mind was operating with a lethal, terrifying clarity. The sudden realization that my only son had willingly committed a federal felony to cover his new wife's predatory loans fundamentally shifted the entire battlefield. This was no longer a simple family dispute over financial boundaries or a tragic case of parental entitlement. This was an organized, desperate extraction operation. I needed to understand the exact dimensions of the enemy's desperation before they launched their next strike. Blindly reacting to their frantic legal attacks would eventually leave me vulnerable to a blindside maneuver. I needed complete, unvarnished intelligence regarding Megan and her entire family structure. I needed a professional who specialized in digging through the darkest, most heavily guarded corners of hidden financial ruins. I needed Gregory. During my final 10 years managing the heavy operations at the steel mill, the corporate executive board attempted to quietly dismantle the workers' pension fund through a series of highly complex shell company transactions. The union needed someone who could brutally dissect corporate ledgers and follow deliberately obscured money trails to protect our livelihoods. We hired Gregory. He was a former forensic accountant for the federal government who had transitioned into private corporate intelligence after growing disgusted with bureaucratic red tape. He was a man utterly devoid of sentimentality, possessing a ruthless, unwavering obsession with numbers and verifiable facts. He did not care about family drama, emotional excuses, or tearful apologies. He only cared about the undeniable truth printed on bank statements, tax returns, and hidden offshore ledgers. I called his private unlisted number the exact moment I sat down inside my vehicle. I did not waste his time with polite pleasantries. I gave him Megan's full maiden name, her current residential address, and a massive cash retainer fee transferred directly into his secure holding account. I instructed him to tear her entire financial history apart, down to the very last penny. Gregory accepted the lucrative contract with a single affirmative grunt and hung up the phone instantly. I spent the next 48 hours systematically fortifying my legal and physical position. I visited my personal attorney and legally revoked all previous medical directives. I drafted an ironclad, indisputable living will entirely excluding Jared from possessing any potential decision-making power over my physical health or my extensive estate. I secured every single physical document in my house inside a newly purchased fireproof biometric floor safe. On Thursday evening, exactly 2 days after the bank incident, a dark, unmarked sedan pulled silently into my driveway. Gregory stepped out into the freezing air holding a thick, heavily bound leather folder. I led him inside and led him directly to my kitchen counter. He did not ask for a warm drink or offer a polite greeting. He dropped the heavy folder onto the granite island with a loud, definitive thud. The sheer volume of the paperwork indicated a massive systemic failure on the part of the Whitmore family. Gregory unbuttoned his heavy wool coat and looked at me with cold, calculating eyes. "Your new daughter-in-law is a highly effective financial predator," Gregory stated flatly, opening the heavy folder to reveal a thick stack of highlighted foreclosure notices and outstanding court judgments. "But she is not acting alone. She is the direct product of a thoroughly bankrupt family ecosystem. You will need to carefully review the specific financial breakdown I compiled in the file named Kichban Ong Da Den Mao 1_21.docex to understand the full scope of their debt. Additionally, the file named Kichban Ong Da Den 2_21.docx contains the undeniable proof that Arthur Whitmore's supposed investment firm is nothing more than a hollow, failing shell." He slid a glossy, high-resolution photograph across the counter. It showed Megan's parents, Arthur and Eleanor Whitmore, standing proudly in front of a massive, sprawling suburban mansion. They were holding expensive champagne flutes at a prestigious country club gala projecting the absolute pinnacle of generational wealth and social elite status. "It is entirely smoke and mirrors," Gregory continued, his voice dripping with professional disgust. "Arthur Whitmore has not generated a single dollar of legitimate income in over 5 years. They have leveraged their massive estate to the absolute maximum limit, taking out tertiary mortgages to fund their lavish country club lifestyle and maintain their fake social standing. They owe over $2 million to various creditors, including several highly dangerous private lenders operating strictly in the shadows. The bank has officially initiated the final stages of a complete foreclosure on their primary estate. They are exactly 3 weeks away from being physically evicted and publicly ruined." I stared down at the highlighted foreclosure documents, feeling the puzzle pieces locking together with sickening, terrifying precision. Megan was not just a greedy, entitled woman looking for an easy ride through life. She was a desperate operative sent out to find a financial host for her rapidly drowning family. "Why Jared?" I asked, keeping my voice dangerously level. "Jared has never possessed independent wealth. He relied entirely on my handouts to survive." Gregory tapped a printed transcript of a comprehensive social media background check. "Your son is a boastful, deeply insecure fool," Gregory said bluntly. "He spent the last 3 years in upscale downtown bars loudly bragging to anyone who would listen about his father's massive multi-million-dollar real estate holdings and vast liquid assets. He desperately wanted to appear wealthy by association. He painted a massive, glowing target on his own back. Megan heard the rumors, verified your property deeds through public county records, and immediately sunk her claws into him. She recognized a weak, easily manipulated conduit to a massive fortune. Jared was specifically targeted to act as the sacrificial lamb to save the Whitmore family from absolute crushing poverty. The precise timeline of Megan's calculated manipulation is thoroughly detailed in the file named Kichban Ong Da Den Mao 1_22.docx. The sheer scale of the manipulation was breathtaking. Jared had essentially sold his own father to a pack of starving wolves just to maintain the pathetic illusion of being a wealthy, successful man. He had traded my safety and my future for a woman who viewed him purely as an extraction tool. He was willing to lock me away in a medical facility just to impress a family of complete frauds. "They are completely out of time," Gregory said, reaching into his heavy coat pocket. "The exact details of their communications with these shadow lenders are logged in the file named Kichban Ong Da Den 2_22.docx. I also pulled a few old federal favors and accessed a legally authorized wiretap connected to one of the predatory lenders currently hunting Arthur Whitmore. The lender automatically recorded a frantic phone call between Megan and Jared this morning to secure leverage." Gregory pressed the playback button and placed the small digital device on the counter. Megan's voice instantly filled the quiet kitchen, but it lacked her usual composed, arrogant sneer. She was screaming with absolute unhinged panic. "I do not care about the bank delay, Jared," she shrieked, her voice cracking with pure desperation. "My father received the final eviction notice today. The bank is seizing the entire estate. You need to push the medical incompetence petition through the judge immediately. You need to testify that your father is a severe danger to himself tomorrow morning. If we do not secure full legal control over his downtown commercial property by the end of this week, my family is entirely destroyed and those private lenders are coming for us next. Get the guardianship approved right now." The recording clicked off abruptly, leaving a heavy, lethal silence lingering in the room. The absolute truth was completely laid bare. They were launching a full-scale legal assault tomorrow morning to steal my life. They were moving in for the final kill. I looked at Gregory and slowly nodded my head. The time for defensive maneuvering was officially over. I was going to obliterate them. I woke up hours before dawn. The house was entirely silent, but the atmosphere felt heavily charged with impending conflict. Gregory's devastating financial revelations from the previous night played on a continuous looping reel in my mind. The Whitmore family was actively drowning in an ocean of insurmountable debt. They needed massive amounts of cash immediately to prevent their imminent eviction from their country club estate. I knew with absolute certainty that they would strike today. The emergency guardianship petition they were frantically building required a compelling narrative of sudden, severe mental decline. They desperately needed me to look unhinged, violent, or hopelessly confused in front of witnesses. I walked into the main living room and placed my smartphone directly in the exact center of the heavy oak coffee table. I activated the voice memo application and left the dark screen facing upward. I wanted them to feel completely falsely comfortable. At precisely 10 o'clock in the morning, two vehicles pulled aggressively into my driveway. I stood deep in the shadows of the hallway and watched through the window blinds. Jared's modest sedan parked directly behind a massive, pristine luxury SUV. Jared and Megan stepped out first. They were quickly followed by a couple I instantly recognized from Gregory's detailed photographic dossier. Arthur and Eleanor Whitmore had arrived. They moved across my driveway with a deliberate, highly performative grace. Arthur wore a sharply tailored navy blazer and pristine Italian leather loafers. Eleanor was draped in heavy cashmere and wore gaudy, oversized diamond jewelry. They looked exactly like the incredibly wealthy, untouchable socialites they aggressively pretended to be. I knew the pathetic truth. I knew the tailored blazer was likely purchased on maxed-out credit cards, and the luxury SUV was currently 3 months behind on its lease payments. I unlocked the heavy brass deadbolts on my front door and pulled it open just as they reached the top of the porch steps. They did not wait for a polite invitation. Arthur stepped forward, instantly projecting the false, overbearing authority of a benevolent patriarch. He extended a manicured, perfectly clean hand toward me. I did not take it. I simply stepped backward and allowed them to physically enter my home. They walked directly into the living room and took their seats on my leather sofas. Jared refused to look at me. He stared intensely at his shoes, his hands clasped tightly between his knees in a posture of complete cowardice. Megan sat rigidly beside him, her spine straight and her face glowing with a triumphant, malicious energy. Arthur and Eleanor took the primary sofa directly across from my armchair. Arthur leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. He adopted a sickeningly soft, meticulously measured tone. It was the exact condescending cadence one might use when speaking to a frightened toddler or a severely traumatized animal. "Tobias, thank you for sitting down with us today." Arthur began, his voice dripping with synthetic, entirely manufactured empathy. "We are all here this morning because we love you. We are deeply, profoundly concerned about your rapidly declining health. Jared has shared some very troubling, heartbreaking stories with us regarding your recent behavior." Eleanor chimed in perfectly on cue, placing a heavily ringed hand dramatically over her heart. "It truly breaks our hearts to see you struggling so much, Tobias. Living entirely alone in this massive, empty house is simply no longer safe for a man in your fragile condition. You are isolated. You are confused. We cannot simply stand by and watch you deteriorate without intervening." I remained perfectly unnervingly silent. I sat deeply in my armchair, keeping my facial muscles entirely relaxed and impassive. I regulated my breathing to a slow, steady rhythm. I knew exactly what psychological game they were attempting to play. They desperately wanted a loud, angry reaction. They wanted me to shout indignities, to physically throw them out of my house, to exhibit the exact aggression and instability they claimed I suffered from. My total, unyielding silence immediately unnerved them. During my decades managing the heavy blast furnaces at the steel mill, I learned that the most effective way to break a hostile, screaming subordinate was to simply stare at them without offering a single word of validation. Silence creates a massive psychological vacuum that arrogant people inevitably rush to fill, usually by exposing their own fatal weaknesses. They expected a fight, not a stone wall. Megan unzipped her oversized designer handbag and pulled out a thick stack of glossy, brightly colored brochures. She leaned forward and slid them aggressively across the coffee table, pushing them right next to my recording smartphone. "We have done extensive, thorough research, Tobias," Megan said, her voice dropping the fake sympathy and adopting a sharp, commanding edge. "We found a wonderful, highly specialized care facility that is perfectly equipped to handle your specific cognitive needs. It is called Shady Pines Convalescent Center. They have 24-hour medical supervision, locked wards for your own protection, and organized daily activities." I looked down at the brochures resting on the wood. I did not need to open them to understand the grim reality. I knew exactly what Shady Pines was. It was a notoriously underfunded, state-run facility located on the bleak industrial edge of the city. It was a depressing warehouse for forgotten, abandoned people, a place where the elderly were essentially parked to die out of sight. The sheer cruelty of their plan crystallized perfectly in my mind. They were not planning to use my stolen assets to place me in a comfortable, high-end retirement community. They intended to dump me in the cheapest, most miserable institution legally available so they could completely hoard every single penny of my wealth to save their failing country club lifestyle. "This is not a debate, Dad," Jared mumbled, finally looking up from the floor. His voice was incredibly weak, trembling with poorly disguised panic. "We are doing this for your own good. You cannot manage your daily life anymore. You almost burned the kitchen down last week. You wander the neighborhood aimlessly at night." He was reciting pure, unadulterated fabrications. He was actively reading from a scripted narrative Megan had written to establish a false medical history for the impending court hearing. I continued to stare directly at him in absolute, unbroken silence. He physically withered under my gaze, dropping his eyes back to the floor. My unwavering silence began to deeply irritate Arthur. He was a man entirely accustomed to bullying his way through life using a carefully maintained facade of wealth and social power. He possessed a massive ego built on a crumbling foundation of desperate debt. He completely mistook my tactical restraint for mental surrender. He genuinely believed he had already won the psychological war. He sat back heavily against the leather sofa, crossing his legs arrogantly. He wanted to assert total, undeniable dominance over the situation. "We are executing this transition swiftly and efficiently," Arthur declared, his voice completely dropping the empathetic tone and adopting a hard, ruthlessly commanding edge. "We are legally relocating you to Shady Pines by the end of this current month. You will not have to worry about a single financial or logistical detail regarding this property." Arthur smiled a cold, shark-like smile. He leaned forward, utterly desperate to show me that he was the man currently in charge of my destiny. "I have already taken the liberty of contacting a highly elite realtor in the downtown district," Arthur stated proudly. "We signed a preliminary listing agreement this morning to get this house on the active market immediately. We need to liquidate this asset as quickly as possible to cover your incoming medical expenses and secure your room at the facility." The sheer blinding arrogance of his statement echoed loudly in the silent room. My phone lay perfectly still on the coffee table, capturing every single syllable in high-definition audio. Arthur Whitmore, a man currently buried under millions of dollars of insurmountable debt, had just confidently and explicitly admitted to signing legal real estate documents to sell a property he did not own. He had actively engaged a professional realtor using a fraudulent medical pretext to illegally list my home. He had officially crossed the line from aggressive family manipulation into a highly documented, incredibly severe federal crime. He had just handed me the exact weapon I needed to destroy them all. I walked out of First National Bank with the freezing winter wind biting sharply against my face, but my mind was operating with a lethal, terrifying clarity. The sudden realization that my only son had willingly committed a federal felony to cover his new wife's predatory loans fundamentally shifted the entire battlefield. This was no longer a simple family dispute over financial boundaries or a tragic case of parental entitlement. This was an organized, desperate extraction operation. I needed to understand the exact dimensions of the enemy's desperation before they launched their next strike. Blindly reacting to their frantic legal attacks would eventually leave me vulnerable to a blindside maneuver. I needed complete, unvarnished intelligence regarding Megan and her entire family structure. I needed a professional who specialized in digging through the darkest, most heavily guarded corners of hidden financial ruins. I needed Gregory. During my final 10 years managing the heavy operations at the steel mill, the corporate executive board attempted to quietly dismantle the workers' pension fund through a series of highly complex shell company transactions. The union needed someone who could brutally dissect corporate ledgers and follow deliberately obscured money trails to protect our livelihoods. We hired Gregory. He was a former forensic accountant for the federal government who had transitioned into private corporate intelligence after growing disgusted with bureaucratic red tape. He was a man utterly devoid of sentimentality, possessing a ruthless, unwavering obsession with numbers and verifiable facts. He did not care about family drama, emotional excuses, or tearful apologies. He only cared about the undeniable truth printed on bank statements, tax returns, and hidden offshore ledgers. I called his private unlisted number the exact moment I sat down inside my vehicle. I did not waste his time with polite pleasantries. I gave him Megan's full maiden name, her current residential address, and a massive cash retainer fee transferred directly into his secure holding account. I instructed him to tear her entire financial history apart down to the very last penny. Gregory accepted the lucrative contract with a single affirmative grunt and hung up the phone instantly. He understood the gravity and the urgency of the assignment. I spent the next 48 hours systematically fortifying my legal and physical position. I visited my personal attorney and legally revoked all previous medical directives. I drafted an ironclad, indisputable living will entirely excluding Jared from possessing any potential decision-making power over my physical health or my extensive estate. I secured every single physical document in my house inside a newly purchased fireproof biometric floor safe. I treated my own home like a bunker preparing for a prolonged siege. On Thursday evening, exactly 2 days after the bank incident, a dark, unmarked sedan pulled silently into my driveway. Gregory stepped out into the freezing air holding a thick, heavily bound leather folder. I unlocked the front door and led him directly to my kitchen counter. He did not ask for a warm drink or offer a polite greeting. He dropped the heavy folder onto the granite island with a loud, definitive thud. The sheer volume of the paperwork indicated a massive systemic failure on the part of the Whitmore family. Gregory unbuttoned his heavy wool coat and looked at me with cold, calculating eyes. "Your new daughter-in-law is a highly effective financial predator," Gregory stated flatly, opening the heavy folder to reveal a thick stack of highlighted foreclosure notices and outstanding court judgments. "But she is not acting alone. She is the direct product of a thoroughly bankrupt family ecosystem. You will need to carefully review the specific financial breakdown I compiled in the file named Kich Ban Ong Da Den Mao 1_23.docx to understand the full scope of their debt. Additionally, the file named Kich Ban Ong Da Den 2_23.docx contains the undeniable proof that Arthur Whitmore's supposed investment firm is nothing more than a hollow, failing shell." He slid a glossy, high-resolution photograph across the counter. It showed Megan's parents, Arthur and Eleanor Whitmore, standing proudly in front of a massive, sprawling suburban mansion. They were holding expensive champagne flutes at a prestigious country club gala, projecting the absolute pinnacle of generational wealth and social elite status. They looked like untouchable aristocrats living a life of pristine luxury. "It is entirely smoke and mirrors," Gregory continued, his voice dripping with professional disgust. "Arthur Whitmore has not generated a single dollar of legitimate income in over 5 years. They have leveraged their massive estate to the absolute maximum limit, taking out tertiary mortgages to fund their lavish country club lifestyle and maintain their fake social standing. They owe over $2 million to various creditors, including several highly dangerous private lenders operating strictly in the shadows. The bank has officially initiated the final stages of a complete foreclosure on their primary estate. They are exactly 3 weeks away from being physically evicted and publicly ruined." I stared down at the highlighted foreclosure documents, feeling the puzzle pieces locking together with sickening, terrifying precision. Megan was not just a greedy, entitled woman looking for an easy ride through life. She was a desperate operative sent out to find a financial host for her rapidly drowning family. She was the final lifeline for a sinking ship. "Why Jared?" I asked, keeping my voice dangerously level. "Jared has never possessed independent wealth. He relied entirely on my handouts to survive his own pathetic failures." Gregory tapped a printed transcript of a comprehensive social media background check. "Your son is a boastful, deeply insecure fool," Gregory said bluntly. "He spent the last 3 years in upscale downtown bars loudly bragging to anyone who would listen about his father's massive multi-million-dollar real estate holdings and vast liquid assets. He desperately wanted to appear wealthy by association. He painted a massive glowing target on his own back. Megan heard the rumors, verified your property deeds through public county records, and immediately sunk her claws into him. She recognized a weak, easily manipulated conduit to a massive fortune. Jared was specifically targeted to act as the sacrificial lamb to save the Whitmore family from absolute crushing poverty. The precise timeline of Megan's calculated manipulation is thoroughly detailed in the file named Kichbon Ong Da Den Mao 1_24.docx. The sheer scale of the manipulation was breathtaking. Jared had essentially sold his own father to a pack of starving wolves just to maintain the illusion of being a wealthy, successful man. He had traded my safety and my future for a woman who viewed him purely as an extraction tool. He was willing to lock me away in a medical facility just to impress a family of complete frauds. "They are completely out of time," Gregory said, reaching into his heavy coat pocket. "The private lenders currently hunting Arthur Whitmore do not operate within the bounds of standard debt collection. They use aggressive, highly illegal surveillance tactics to track their debtors. The exact details of their communications with these shadow lenders are logged in the file named Kichbon Ong Da Den 2_24.docx. I pulled a few old federal favors and accessed a legally authorized wiretap connected to one of these shadow agencies. The lender automatically recorded a frantic phone call between Megan and Jared this morning to secure leverage." Gregory pressed the playback button and placed the small digital device on the counter. Megan's voice instantly filled the quiet kitchen, but it lacked her usual composed, arrogant sneer. She was screaming with absolute unhinged panic. "I do not care about the bank delay, Jared," she shrieked, her voice cracking with pure desperation. "My father received the final eviction notice today. The bank is seizing the entire estate. You need to push the medical incompetence claim against your father through the judge immediately. You need to testify that he is a severe danger to himself tomorrow morning. If we do not secure full legal control over his assets before the end of this week, my family is entirely destroyed and those private lenders are coming for us next. Expedite the guardianship claim right now." The recording clicked off abruptly, leaving a heavy, lethal silence lingering in the room. The absolute truth was completely laid bare. The medical incompetence claim was not a precautionary measure. It was a frantic ticking time bomb driven by the Whitmore family's imminent destruction. They were launching a full-scale legal assault to steal my life before they lost their own. I looked at Gregory and slowly nodded my head. The time for defensive maneuvering was officially over. I was going to obliterate them. The heavy oak door shut with a solid echoing thud, sealing the Whitmore family outside in the freezing winter air. I remained standing in the center of my living room, staring at the glossy brochures for Shady Pines scattered across my coffee table. Beside them, my smartphone sat perfectly still, having captured every single syllable of Arthur Whitmore's arrogant, fatal confession. He had admitted to illegally listing my home for sale. He had admitted to treating my life as a liquid asset to bail out his bankrupt existence. I picked up the phone, saved the audio file to 3 separate secure cloud servers, and walked into my office. The defensive phase of this war was officially over. The very next morning, the enemy launched their anticipated frontal assault. I was drinking my black coffee when a sharp, aggressive knock rattled the front door. I opened it to find a young man in a cheap suit holding a thick manila envelope. He asked to confirm my identity. The moment I nodded, he shoved the envelope against my chest, muttered a legal formality, and practically sprinted back to his vehicle. I walked back to the kitchen island and tore the envelope open. It was an official court summons for an emergency competency hearing. Jared and Megan had filed a formal petition for total, unrestricted medical and financial guardianship. The attached affidavit was a masterpiece of absolute fiction. Jared had sworn under penalty of perjury that I was suffering from severe rapid-onset dementia, prone to violent outbursts, and completely incapable of managing my basic daily needs. They were demanding the court strip me of my human rights by the end of the week. They expected me to hire a standard family law attorney. They expected a polite emotional mediation where they could fake tears and play the role of concerned children. I did not hire a family lawyer. I picked up my phone and called Richard Sullivan. Richard Sullivan was a corporate litigator who operated with the mechanical ruthlessness of a military drone strike. 15 years ago, when the corporate board at the steel mill attempted a hostile restructuring designed to strip senior management of our vested stock options, the union hired Sullivan. He did not negotiate. He buried the board in a mountain of indisputable financial evidence, entirely dismantling their legal team and securing our futures. He was cold, meticulous, and absolutely devoid of empathy. When I walked into his high-rise downtown office an hour later, I did not offer a handshake. I dropped the court summons, the forged power of attorney from the bank, Gregory's extensive financial dossier on the Whitmores, and the audio recording of Arthur's confession directly onto his polished glass desk. Sullivan did not speak. He spent 45 minutes methodically reviewing every single document. He listened to the audio recording twice, his eyes fixed on the city skyline outside his window. When he finally looked at me, his expression was entirely devoid of warmth. "Your son has handed us a loaded weapon," Sullivan stated, his voice flat and precise. "This guardianship petition is built entirely on fabricated medical assertions and a forged legal document. If we move defensively and file an injunction today, the judge will simply delay the hearing and order a court-appointed mediator. We are not going to do that. We are going to let your son walk into a federal courtroom, place his hand on a Bible, and commit absolute undeniable perjury. We are going to let him dig the hole so deep that the federal prosecutors will simply have to push dirt over him." I nodded slowly. "What do you need from me to build the trap?" "I need undeniable, medically unassailable proof that you are the most competent, lucid man in this city," Sullivan replied. "Jared's entire legal strategy hinges on the assumption that you will appear angry, confused, or frightened in front of a judge. We will obliterate that assumption before you even step foot in the courthouse." Within 2 hours, Sullivan had utilized his vast corporate network to schedule immediate, rigorous evaluations with 3 of the most highly credentialed psychiatric specialists in the state. I did not visit standard family therapists. One was a former military psychologist who specialized in evaluating combat pilots for active duty. Another was a leading neurological researcher at the state university. Over the next 48 hours, I sat in sterile, brilliantly lit medical offices undergoing relentless cognitive testing. They tested my short-term memory, my spatial reasoning, my complex problem-solving capabilities, and my emotional regulation under extreme stress. I approached the psychological evaluations with the exact same industrial mindset I used to calibrate the blast furnaces at the mill. I answered every question with cold, measured precision. I solved their logic puzzles flawlessly. I recounted my entire financial history, asset allocations, and the specific details of Jared's criminal activities with absolute terrifying clarity. By Thursday afternoon, I walked out of the final clinic holding 3 separate notarized and legally bulletproof medical certificates of absolute mental competency. The doctors had unanimously concluded that my cognitive function was operating at an elite level, far exceeding the baseline for a man of my age. Jared's fabricated narrative of severe dementia was now legally dead. I drove directly back to Sullivan's downtown office to deliver the medical certificates. I expected to find him finalizing our aggressive courtroom strategy. Instead, I found him standing rigidly behind his desk, staring intensely at a series of complex real estate ledgers glowing on his computer monitor. The atmosphere in his office had shifted from calculated preparation to a state of absolute lethal urgency. I placed the medical certificates on his desk. He did not even look at them. "I initiated a routine comprehensive title and encumbrance check on all of your physical assets this morning," Sullivan said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. I needed to establish a clean financial baseline before the hearing to ensure Jared had not attempted any further minor withdrawals from your secondary accounts. Sullivan turned the heavy monitor toward me. The screen displayed a highly classified preliminary real estate transaction log. It was not connected to my residential home. It was connected directly to my highly lucrative multi-million-dollar commercial property located in the center of the downtown business district. Arthur Whitmore lied to you in your living room, Sullivan stated coldly. He did not just sign a preliminary listing agreement for your residential house. That was a distraction tactic. While Arthur kept you focused on the house, Jared used the forged power of attorney to officially sign a binding preliminary sale agreement for your downtown commercial building. He initiated the transaction with an out-of-state corporate holding company. I stared at the glowing numbers on the screen. The sheer scale of the theft was staggering. They were attempting to liquidate my most valuable asset and wire the funds directly into a series of untraceable shell accounts to pay off the Whitmore family's shadow lenders. Because the holding company is located across state lines and because Jared initiated the preliminary escrow transfer digitally, Sullivan continued, his eyes locked onto mine. This is no longer a simple case of elder financial abuse or state-level forgery. Jared has officially triggered federal jurisdiction. He has committed textbook multi-million-dollar wire fraud and interstate real estate fraud. The moment that forged signature was transmitted across state lines, your son guaranteed himself a mandatory minimum sentence in a federal penitentiary. The trap they had set for me had just evolved into an inescapable federal prison cell for Jared. Megan had pushed him to move too fast, forcing him to execute a massive, sloppy corporate transaction that left a blazing digital trail directly to his forged signature. They thought they were outsmarting a confused, isolated old man. Instead, they had just handed a ruthless corporate litigator the exact evidence required to destroy their lives permanently. I looked at the glowing screen, feeling no sorrow, no hesitation, and absolutely no mercy. The ironclad defense was complete. It was time to execute the offensive strike. The drive back from Richard Sullivan's downtown office was a masterclass in emotional compartmentalization. I had just viewed undeniable digital evidence that my only child had committed a multi-million-dollar federal crime. He had utilized a forged power of attorney to initiate the sale of my commercial property to a shadow holding company to save his bankrupt in-laws. Sullivan had been incredibly explicit regarding our next tactical maneuver. We possessed the digital footprint of the wire fraud, but federal prosecutors required absolute airtight proof of malicious intent. Jared and his wife Megan could easily hire a defense team to claim the transfer was a tragic misunderstanding or a clerical error driven by a desperate desire to protect my assets. We needed to eliminate the defense of ignorance. We needed Jared to voluntarily present the forged documents in a public setting and actively demand my signature. We needed him to hang himself with his own rope. I required a scenario where his greed would completely override his caution. I had to become the bait. I arrived at my empty house and immediately initiated the physical preparations for the trap. I drove to a specialized electronics retailer on the industrial side of the city. I bypassed the standard home security aisles and purchased 4 high-definition motion-activated micro cameras utilizing encrypted wireless transmitters. When I returned home, I spent 2 hours meticulously installing the surveillance network. I embedded the first lens deep inside the ornate wooden molding of the dining room chandelier, angling it directly downward to capture the entire surface of the heavy mahogany table. I concealed the second camera behind the thick leather spine of an encyclopedia resting on the living room bookshelf, ensuring a flawless, unobstructed view of the primary seating area. I tested the audio receivers by dropping a heavy brass pen onto the hardwood floor from 20 feet away. The playback on my smartphone was crystal clear. Every single breath whisper and footstep in that room would be permanently recorded and securely uploaded to Sullivan's private server. The next phase required a physical prop to trigger Jared's overwhelming impatience. I sat at my home office desk and began drafting a document. I deliberately avoided using standard legal templates. I titled the paperwork, Preliminary Declaration of Voluntary Asset Transfer. I filled the pages with dense, convoluted legal jargon that essentially promised to surrender total ownership of the downtown commercial property directly to Jared. The document was entirely non-binding and completely legally useless, but it looked incredibly official and undeniably tempting. It was the exact financial lifeline the Whitmore family desperately needed to avoid their impending foreclosure. I printed the false declaration on heavy, expensive bond paper. I carried the document into the dining room and placed it directly in the center of the mahogany table, resting my reading glasses carefully on top of the pages. It looked exactly like the private work of a tired, defeated old man trying to organize his final affairs. I walked back into the living room and sat heavily in my leather armchair. I needed to execute a flawless, highly calibrated psychological performance. For 40 years managing the blast furnaces at the steel mill, my entire professional survival depended on projecting absolute strength and unyielding authority. Now I had to project complete systemic surrender. I regulated my breathing, softening the rigid posture of my shoulders and letting my head drop slightly toward my chest. I dialed Jared's cell phone. He answered on the fourth ring, his voice laced with the sharp defensive hostility of a man bracing for an aggressive confrontation. He expected me to scream about the impending competency hearing. I did not raise my voice. I spoke in a low, exhausted rasp. "Jared, we need to talk," I said, allowing a slight manufactured tremor to enter my syllables. "I am sitting here alone, and I am simply too tired to keep fighting you and your wife. The stress of this impending courtroom battle is tearing my mind apart. I am losing track of my days. I am forgetting simple things. If you truly believe I can no longer manage the commercial properties, I do not want to endure the public humiliation of a competency hearing. I want to settle this privately between a father and his son." The shift in Jared's tone was instantaneous and physically sickening. The defensive hostility evaporated entirely, replaced instantly by a slick, eager warmth. The predator had caught the scent of blood. He immediately dropped his aggressive posture and adopted the sickeningly sweet cadence of a deeply concerned caregiver. He told me that a private settlement was exactly what he and Megan had always wanted for me. He promised that they only had my best interests at heart. I told him I had drafted some preliminary paperwork regarding the transfer of the commercial building and asked if he could come over to review the parameters. Jared agreed with an intense, breathless speed. He promised to be at my house in less than 20 minutes. He arrived in exactly 14. I unlocked the front door and stepped back, letting my spine curve forward. Jared walked into the foyer, practically vibrating with restrained energy. He attempted to mask his sheer greed behind a facade of gentle filial concern, asking me how my head was feeling. I gave him a slow, vacant stare, rubbing my temples as if fighting through a dense fog of confusion. I muttered something barely coherent about needing to finalize the estate before my memory failed completely. I turned and shuffled slowly toward the dining room, ensuring my footsteps dragged heavily across the hardwood floor. Jared followed closely behind me, his eyes darting hungrily around the silent house. We entered the dining room. The heavy bond paper sat perfectly illuminated under the chandelier, the bold title regarding the asset transfer clearly visible. Jared's eyes locked onto the document instantly, his entire body tensed like a coiled spring. I pulled out a chair and gripped the mahogany table, letting out a long, ragged sigh. I looked at Jared with manufactured vulnerability. I told him that reading the dense legal text was giving me a severe migraine. I excused myself, stating I needed to go into the kitchen to brew a strong pot of coffee to clear my head. I told him to make himself comfortable and look over the draft. I turned and walked out of the room, leaving my son entirely alone with the bait. I stepped into the kitchen and moved silently out of the direct line of sight from the hallway. I did not touch the coffee maker. I pulled my smartphone from my pocket and immediately accessed the live encrypted feed from the hidden dining room camera. The high-definition screen illuminated my son's true nature. Jared did not wait even 10 seconds. The absolute moment he believed he was unobserved, the fake caring posture vanished completely. He lunged toward the table with the frantic, jerky movements of a starving animal. He snatched the heavy bond paper and began reading the paragraphs with terrifying speed. A massive, victorious smile spread across his face as he read the clauses promising the total surrender of the commercial property. He reached into his tailored jacket pocket and pulled out his own smartphone. He held the document flat against the table and frantically snapped high-resolution photographs of every single page. He wanted immediate, verifiable proof of his impending victory. He shoved the document back under my reading glasses and dialed a number, pacing nervously around the edge of the dining table. The audio receiver captured his breathless voice perfectly. He was calling Megan. He did not bother with greetings. He spoke in a rapid, hushed tone fueled by sheer, unadulterated excitement. He told her the psychological pressure had completely broken the old man. He explicitly stated that Tobias was sitting in the next room complaining about severe memory loss and exhaustion. Jared told his wife that I had already drafted the transfer documents for the downtown commercial property. and was entirely willing to sign them immediately just to avoid a public courtroom battle. "We do not need the emergency hearing, Megan," Jared whispered fiercely into the receiver, his eyes locked on the kitchen door. "If we drag him into a federal court, the judge might order independent psychiatric evaluations. The court mediators will scrutinize the commercial transfer and the bank accounts. We cannot risk the exposure right now with your father's creditors closing in. He is ready to hand it over voluntarily today. We need to drop the competency petition right now. We bring the notary here tonight, get his signature on the real transfer documents, and completely bypass the legal system. It is over. We won." I stood perfectly still in the quiet kitchen watching the screen as my son actively dismantled his own legal defense. By choosing to drop the formal competency hearing in favor of a rushed voluntary signature, they were actively attempting to circumvent federal judicial oversight to execute a fraudulent wire transfer. They believed they had successfully cornered a broken, isolated old man. They had absolutely no idea they were walking blindly into a meticulously constructed, inescapable legal slaughterhouse. The heavy mahogany door clicked shut, leaving my dining room in absolute echoing silence. I remained seated at the head of the table, staring at the exact spot where the fraudulent deed had rested just moments before. Megan's hysterical, unhinged screaming still seemed to vibrate against the glass of the chandelier. Her meticulously maintained facade of aristocratic superiority had shattered completely the second I pointed out the fatal legal flaw in the transfer document. She had panicked, shrieking the absolute truth into the open air. Her parents were losing their estate to the bank in exactly 5 days. Jared had physically dragged her out of my house, his face pale and contorted with a mixture of profound shock and rising fury. He had spent the last 2 years genuinely believing he was marrying into the pinnacle of generational wealth. He had just discovered he was permanently shackled to a sinking ship of insurmountable debt. I did not move to clear the dessert plates. I walked directly into my home office and woke up my encrypted laptop. I needed to know exactly how Jared would react to the sudden violent detonation of his entire social reality. During Jared's sophomore year of college, I had set up a shared family cloud server to easily transfer his tuition documents and textbook receipts. It was a digital relic, a forgotten piece of our past that I knew for a fact Jared still used to back up his smartphone data. I opened the main directory. A brand new continuously syncing audio file had just appeared in the primary folder. The sheer arrogance of my son was entirely predictable. Jared had clearly activated a secret voice memo on his phone before sitting down at my dining table. He had desperately intended to secretly record our conversation, hoping to capture me sounding senile, confused, or medically incompetent to bolster his upcoming guardianship petition. In his frantic rush to drag his hysterical wife out of my house, he had completely forgotten to stop the recording. His phone was currently sitting in his pocket, actively broadcasting every single word spoken inside their vehicle directly to my personal computer. I put on my noise-canceling headphones, leaned back in my leather chair, and pressed play. The audio feed began with the heavy, violent slamming of 2 car doors. The engine of Jared's sedan roared to life, but the vehicle did not shift into gear. The confined space of the car amplified the absolute raw hostility radiating from my son. "You lied to me," Jared said. His voice was not loud, but it possessed a trembling, dangerous edge that I had rarely heard him use. "You looked me directly in the eyes for 2 years, and you lied about everything. Your father is not a venture capitalist. Your family is completely broke. You are functionally bankrupt. You are losing your house in 5 days. Tell me the truth right now, Megan. Are you entirely destitute?" For several long seconds, the recording captured nothing but the heavy, rapid breathing of 2 people locked in a confined space. When Megan finally spoke, the shrill, panicked hysteria from my dining room had vanished entirely. She did not yell. She did not aggressively defend her parents. She executed a tactical, masterfully calibrated emotional pivot. She began to cry. It was not the chaotic sobbing of a defeated woman. It was a soft, rhythmic, perfectly weaponized sound designed to bypass a man's anger and target his fundamental insecurities. "I was terrified, Jared," Megan whispered, her voice trembling with synthetic vulnerability. "My father is a complete failure. He destroyed our family legacy with his massive ego and his terrible investments. He lied to my mother, and he lied to me. I did not know the absolute severity of the debt until a few weeks ago when the shadow lenders started calling my personal cell phone. I was so incredibly ashamed. I look at you, and I see a strong, successful, independent man. I see a man who takes control of his destiny. I was terrified that if I told you the pathetic truth about my family, you would leave me. I was trying to protect our marriage." I listened with cold, clinical fascination. Megan was a psychological architect. She was actively neutralizing Jared's justified rage by stroking his fragile ego. She was feeding him the exact narrative he desperately needed to hear. She was painting him as the strong, dominant patriarch, while simultaneously framing herself as a helpless victim of her father's incompetence. Jared's heavy breathing slowed. The silence in the car stretched out thick with his internal calculation. "We are deeply implicated in this, Megan," Jared muttered, the anger in his voice rapidly morphing into sheer panic. "I signed the preliminary commercial sale agreement using the power of attorney. I initiated the escrow transfer with that out-of-state holding company. If we do not secure the final notarized deed transfer from my father, that corporate firm is going to sue us for breach of contract. We are looking at massive financial penalties. We are looking at federal wire fraud." "Your father knows exactly what he is doing," Megan said, her voice dropping into a hard, venomous whisper. The tears vanished instantly. She was moving in for the kill. Tobias did not find a random legal flaw in that document tonight by accident. He is actively playing games with our lives. He is a bitter, spiteful old man sitting on a mountain of hoarded wealth, and he wants to watch us burn. He wants you to fail, Jared. He has always looked down on you. He wants to see you humiliated in a federal courtroom. Are you really going to let him destroy our future just to protect his massive bank accounts? She was expertly shifting the target. She was taking the blame for the fraudulent wire transfer and placing it squarely on my shoulders. She was convincing my son that my refusal to be robbed was an act of malicious aggression against his survival. "We dropped the competency hearing to try and do this peacefully," Megan continued, her voice accelerating with urgent, demanding energy. "We tried to handle this like a family. He spat in our faces. We do not have time to go back to the judge. My parents will be thrown onto the street by Monday. The out-of-state holding company will report the failed transfer to the federal authorities by Tuesday. We are out of options. You have the original digital file of the deed on your laptop. You have the digital signature stamps we purchased. You have the access codes to the county clerk's e-filing portal." "That is highly illegal," Jared whispered. His voice was weak. The last remaining fragments of his moral compass were rapidly dissolving under her pressure. "Filing a forged property deed electronically is a severe felony. If the county clerk flags the signature mismatch, I will go to prison. If you do not file that document tonight, you are going to prison anyway for the preliminary wire fraud." Megan shot back, her tone absolutely ruthless and commanding. "We are already standing over the edge of the cliff. We have to jump. We file the deed electronically tonight. The county clerk's automated system processes the transfer by tomorrow morning. The commercial property legally shifts into your name. We immediately finalize the sale to the holding company, extract the millions, pay off the shadow lenders, and disappear. Tobias will wake up on Monday morning completely powerless. He will have no legal standing to reverse an authorized federal transfer. You have to choose Jared. It is either your spiteful father's bank account or our survival. Be the man I married. Do it." The recording captured a profound, suffocating silence. I sat perfectly still in my home office, staring at the audio waveform moving across my monitor. I was waiting for my son to make the ultimate, irreversible decision. I was waiting to see if a single shred of loyalty or basic human decency remained inside his mind. "I will log into the portal as soon as we get back to the house," Jared said. His voice was completely hollow, entirely devoid of emotion. "I will file the transfer." The engine revved loudly. The audio feed cut to static as the car pulled away from the curb and drove into the night. I removed my headphones and placed them gently on the desk. I did not feel a single trace of sorrow. I felt the absolute cold satisfaction of a trap snapping shut with flawless mechanical precision. I closed the audio file and opened my encrypted email client. I had previously instructed Richard Sullivan to place a highly classified priority legal alert on the downtown commercial property through the county clerk's internal fraud division. Any attempt to modify, transfer, or encumber the deed would trigger an immediate automated notification directly to my secure inbox. I sat in the darkness of my office and waited. 45 minutes later, the screen illuminated my face with a bright, solitary notification. The subject line was generated automatically by the state property registration portal. It confirmed the successful electronic submission of a warranty deed transferring total ownership of my commercial building to Jared Roberts. My son had just electronically filed a massively forged legal document across state lines using a federal registry network. He had officially cemented the final undeniable element of a multi-million-dollar federal crime. He had chosen the fraudulent wife, and he had chosen the money. He believed he had just secured his wealthy future. He did not realize he had just locked the door to his own federal prison cell. I picked up my smartphone and forwarded the automated county alert directly to Richard Sullivan. The message I attached contained only 3 words: execute the strike. The pale light of early morning had barely crested the city skyline when the secure line on my desk phone shattered the silence of my home office. I had remained awake the entire night watching the digital timestamp on the county clerk's automated fraud alert glow in the darkness. I picked up the receiver on the first ring. Richard Sullivan did not bother with pleasantries. His voice was sharp, analytical, and completely devoid of fatigue. He informed me that the county clerk's internal fraud division had successfully intercepted Jared's electronic submission. The forged warranty deed transferring total ownership of my downtown commercial property was currently suspended in a digital holding pattern. Because Sullivan had preemptively filed a classified legal alert on the property, the automated system had flagged the fraudulent signature mismatch before the transfer could be legally finalized in the public registry. Sullivan explained the precise mechanics of the federal legal threshold. If we maintained the fraud alert and instructed the county clerk to reject the submission, Jared would be guilty of attempted real estate fraud and state-level forgery. Those were serious charges, but a high-priced defense attorney could potentially argue that Jared was acting under severe emotional distress, negotiating a plea deal that might result in probation or a suspended sentence. Sullivan stated clearly that if we wanted to guarantee a mandatory minimum sentence in a federal penitentiary, we needed to cross a very specific legal boundary. We needed the fraudulent document to officially record on a federal level. We needed the state to formally recognize the forged transfer. I did not hesitate. I instructed Sullivan to immediately contact his liaison inside the county clerk's office. I ordered him to voluntarily lift the fraud alert override, the automated suspension, and allow the forged warranty deed to process completely through the federal registry. Sullivan warned me that for a brief, highly dangerous window of time, my son would be the undisputed legal owner of my most valuable commercial asset. If Jared moved fast enough, he could finalize the secondary sale to the out-of-state holding company before we could deploy our trap. I accepted the risk without a single trace of fear. I wanted the federal charges locked in permanently. I wanted the wire fraud to be a cemented, indisputable historical fact. I gave Sullivan the explicit authorization to let my son steal my building. With the defensive trap fully armed and waiting to snap shut, it was time to execute a catastrophic offensive strike against the true architects of this betrayal. I dressed in a dark suit, locked my house, and drove directly into the heart of the financial district. Jared and Megan had built their entire criminal conspiracy upon a fundamental, catastrophic miscalculation regarding my financial reality. They looked at me and saw a retired steel mill manager living on a fixed pension, supplemented by the rental income of a few local commercial properties. They believed my visible assets represented the absolute limit of my wealth. They were profoundly, aggressively wrong. 30 years ago, while I was calibrating blast furnaces on the midnight shift, my late wife and I had recognized the explosive potential of emerging international technology markets. We had quietly diverted every spare dollar of our income into a series of aggressive, highly classified offshore investment trusts. Over the decades, those initial investments had compounded into a silent, untraceable financial empire. We deliberately chose to maintain a simple middle-class lifestyle. We kept the offshore wealth entirely hidden from Jared because we desperately wanted him to learn the value of hard labor discipline and self-reliance. We wanted to protect him from the toxic, corrupting influence of unearned generational wealth. The bitter, suffocating irony was that our attempt to foster humility had only bred a deep, festering resentment and a venomous sense of entitlement inside our son. Now that exact hidden fortune was going to serve as the weapon of his absolute destruction. I arrived at Sullivan's high-rise office and walked directly into the primary conference room. Sullivan was already waiting at the polished glass table, surrounded by a mountain of financial ledgers and glowing computer monitors. The atmosphere in the room was electric with calculated malice. I sat down and told Sullivan that securing Jared's federal indictment was no longer sufficient. I wanted to completely obliterate the foundation of the Whitmore family's arrogance. I wanted to dismantle the aristocratic facade that Megan had used to manipulate my son into committing a felony. Sullivan turned a heavy monitor toward me, displaying the intricate, highly confidential financial dossier he had compiled on Arthur Whitmore's crumbling estate. The numbers were staggering in their sheer incompetence. Arthur had leveraged the massive Whitmore family compound against a series of disastrous corporate investments. He was drowning in toxic debt. The primary bank holding the residential mortgage had officially classified the loan as an unrecoverable default. The shadow lenders were circling the property like vultures. Sullivan confirmed the exact timeline Megan had screamed in my dining room. The bank was legally positioned to initiate aggressive public foreclosure proceedings in exactly 5 days. I leaned forward, resting my hands flat against the cold glass table. I looked at Sullivan and delivered my instructions with the mechanical precision of an industrial executioner. I told him that I did not want a faceless corporate bank to foreclose on Arthur Whitmore. I did not want the state to take their family home. I wanted absolute dictatorial control over their physical sanctuary. I instructed Sullivan to immediately utilize the liquid capital inside my offshore trusts to contact the primary bank. I ordered him to purchase the entirety of the Whitmore's defaulted residential debt portfolio directly from the institutional lenders. Sullivan's eyes narrowed in cold, predatory approval. He understood the tactical brilliance of the maneuver instantly. Banks despise the messy, prolonged public spectacle of residential foreclosures. They prefer liquidity. If we offered to purchase the toxic debt portfolio in a single massive cash transaction, the bank would eagerly sign over the rights to avoid the legal friction of an eviction. Sullivan picked up his encrypted phone and initiated the corporate buyout through a masked anonymous holding company registered entirely under my ultimate control. I sat in the silent conference room and watched a master corporate litigator dismantle a family legacy in less than 3 hours. Sullivan ruthlessly negotiated the premium cash transfer, entirely bypassing the standard bureaucratic delays. He leveraged the massive weight of my offshore capital to force the immediate, unconditional surrender of the deed of trust. By early afternoon, the digital transaction cleared the federal banking networks. The legal shift in power was absolute, silent, and totally devastating. Sullivan printed the final confirmation documents and slid them across the glass table. I picked up the heavy watermarked pages. I was holding the physical promissory notes and the exclusive deed of trust to the Whitmore estate. The bank was completely removed from the equation. I was no longer merely a victim defending a commercial asset against a forged deed. I was now the sole undisputed creditor of Arthur Whitmore's entire existence. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling window looking out over the sprawling city, feeling the weight of the legal documents in my hand. Somewhere in a luxurious, heavily mortgaged apartment, Jared and Megan were undoubtedly celebrating. They were opening champagne, entirely convinced that their fraudulent digital filing had successfully secured their wealthy future. They believed they had outsmarted a tired, isolated old man. They had absolutely no idea that their stolen commercial building was a highly calibrated federal trap designed to lock them in prison. More importantly, they had no idea that while they were celebrating their theft, the very ground beneath the Whitmore family's feet had shifted ownership. The iron grip was now perfectly complete. I held the absolute, unassailable legal authority to render Arthur and his arrogant family entirely homeless by the end of the week, and I possessed the exact mechanism to watch my son realize he had destroyed his life for absolutely nothing. The following morning arrived with a deceptive calm. While Richard Sullivan meticulously dismantled the Whitmore family's legal claim to their sprawling estate, Jared and Megan operated under a spectacular delusion of absolute victory. The automated county clerk system had processed their fraudulent warranty deed, temporarily shielding their crime behind a veneer of bureaucratic legitimacy. Believing they now legally controlled a multi-million-dollar commercial asset, their greed accelerated into sheer recklessness. They did not wait for the secondary sale to the out-of-state holding company to finalize. They needed immediate gratification to soothe the massive blow of Arthur Whitmore's impending bankruptcy. Through Sullivan's relentless surveillance of their financial footprint, I watched them orchestrate a masterclass in premature celebration. Jared leveraged the pending escrow agreement and the forged commercial deed as absolute proof of impending wealth. He approached a luxury real estate broker and secured a lease on a sprawling glass-walled penthouse in the city's most exclusive residential high-rise. They signed the contract with arrogant flourishes, committing to an astronomical monthly rent and a massive security deposit based entirely on phantom capital. They hired premium moving companies to transport their belongings out of their previous modest apartment, charging every single expense to a new tier of high-interest credit cards. They were building a fortress of extreme luxury directly on top of a legal landmine. I sat in my home office reviewing the digital copy of their new penthouse lease agreement that Sullivan had intercepted. The address printed at the top of the contract sent a cold, sharp thrill down my spine. The building was a towering architectural marvel named the Obsidian. 10 years ago, my late wife and I recognized a shift in the local housing market toward ultra-premium urban living. We utilized a fraction of our offshore capital to establish an anonymous holding entity named Apex Vanguard. Apex Vanguard subsequently purchased the Obsidian outright. For a decade, I had been the silent, absolute owner of the very building Jared and Megan now considered their triumphant sanctuary. They had attempted to steal my commercial property to escape their financial ruin, and in their blind arrogance they had walked directly into the center of my residential empire. I immediately contacted Sullivan and instructed him to coordinate a secure conference call with Marcus Vance, the senior property manager of the Obsidian. Marcus was a fiercely loyal, highly competent executive who operated under the strict understanding that Apex Vanguard demanded absolute discretion and zero tolerance for tenant fraud. I did not reveal my identity as Tobias Roberts during the call. I spoke as the faceless director of the holding company, utilizing Sullivan as my legal proxy. Sullivan presented Marcus with the indisputable evidence of Jared's financial deception. He provided the certified documentation proving that the commercial deed Jared used as collateral to secure the penthouse lease was currently flagged in a federal fraud investigation. Furthermore, the escrow funds Jared claimed were days away from clearing were completely frozen by the county clerk's internal security division. Jared had essentially committed criminal fraud to bypass the Obsidian's rigorous financial screening process. Marcus reviewed the dossier with cold professional outrage. He confirmed that submitting fraudulent proof of funds constituted a catastrophic violation of their leasing agreement. It bypassed the standard 30-day eviction protocols, entirely triggering an emergency termination clause designed to protect the building from high-liability con artists. I gave the final irrevocable order. I instructed Marcus to draft an immediate, unappealable 3-day pay-or-quit eviction notice. However, knowing Jared possessed absolutely no liquid capital, the demand for payment was merely a legal formality. I wanted the notice delivered with maximum psychological impact. I instructed Marcus to dispatch the building's private security detail to hand-deliver the document directly to the penthouse doors. I wanted Jared and Megan to feel the sudden violent collapse of their fabricated reality while they were still unpacking their designer luggage. The execution of the order was flawless. Less than 2 hours later, Sullivan forwarded a brief security report from Marcus. 2 armed, uniformed guards had arrived at the penthouse suite. They had knocked loudly, bypassing the polite concierge protocols. When Jared opened the door, radiating his usual arrogant entitlement, the guards stepped forward and pressed the heavy legal envelope directly into his chest. They informed him loudly, ensuring the words echoed down the pristine marble hallway, that he had 72 hours to produce the entire annual lease in cleared, verifiable cash, or he and his wife would be physically escorted off the premises and their belongings surrendered to the street. The trap had snapped shut with bone-crushing force. Jared and Megan were now entirely trapped between 2 rapidly closing walls of destruction. The commercial funds they desperately needed to pay the impossible rent demand were locked in a federal fraud investigation they had triggered themselves. Meanwhile, the Whitmore estate was quietly being absorbed into my offshore portfolio, cutting off any possibility of a bailout from Megan's parents. They were suffocating in a vacuum of their own creation. I did not have to wait long for the inevitable explosion. I was sitting at my kitchen island, calmly drinking a cup of black coffee, when my smartphone began to vibrate violently across the granite countertop. The caller ID flashed with Megan's personal cell phone number. The sheer desperation of her calling me directly signaled a total systemic collapse of her psychological defenses. She had spent 2 years treating me with thinly veiled disdain, viewing me as an ignorant, disposable stepping stone. Now she was dialing my number as a drowning woman reaching for a life raft. I let the phone ring 4 times, methodically, savoring the mechanical sound before slowly dragging my thumb across the screen to answer. I did not speak. I let the silence stretch across the cellular connection, forcing her to initiate the conversation. "Tobias!" Megan screamed. Her voice was not merely panicked, it was a raw, primal shriek of absolute terror. The carefully modulated aristocratic tone she wore like armor was completely gone. She sounded like an animal caught in a snare. "Tobias, you have to help us right now. You have to send money to Jared's account this exact second. We are being evicted. The building management is threatening to throw us out onto the street in 3 days. They sent armed guards to our door. You have to wire us cash immediately." She was screaming at her landlord. She was demanding that the man she had conspired to rob instantly bail her out of an eviction that he had personally authorized. The sheer blinding magnitude of her ignorance was almost poetic. She genuinely believed she could still manipulate me. She believed that playing the role of the terrified, helpless daughter-in-law would trigger a protective instinct I had permanently severed days ago. "Why would armed guards arrive at your door, Megan?" I asked. I kept my voice incredibly slow, flat, and entirely drained of empathy. I projected the cold detachment of a bank teller declining a fraudulent transaction. "Jared assured me your family was incredibly wealthy. He assured me the transfer of my commercial property was necessary to facilitate your massive new investments. If you are so wealthy, why are you begging an old man for rent money?" "The escrow is delayed," she sobbed, her breath hitching wildly into the receiver. "The commercial transfer got stuck in a county holding pattern. We do not have access to the funds yet. The building manager is a complete psychopath. He refuses to wait for the bank clearance. He is demanding the entire annual lease in pure cash by Friday, or we lose everything. Tobias, please. We have nowhere else to go. My father is dealing with a temporary liquidity issue. We cannot stay with him. You have to wire us $50,000 right now. Jared is your son. You cannot let them throw us onto the street." I listened to her beg, feeling the profound satisfaction of absolute victory. She had confirmed every single detail of their impending ruin. She had admitted the escrow was frozen. She had admitted her father was bankrupt. She had admitted they were entirely destitute. She was completely unaware that every frantic word she screamed into the phone was currently being recorded, encrypted, and cataloged by my internal security network. "I cannot help you, Megan," I stated, my voice dropping to a low, unforgiving register. "I am a retired steelworker. I live on a fixed pension. I certainly do not have $50,000 in liquid cash to wire you. Perhaps Jared should not have signed a lease he could not afford. Perhaps you should call the county clerk and ask them why your commercial transfer was flagged for fraud." I did not wait for her to respond. I pressed the end call button and placed the phone face down on the granite counter. The illusion of their victory was officially dead. The reality of their destruction had arrived. The conference room at Sterling and Hayes Title Company was designed to project absolute security and quiet, unassailable wealth. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a commanding panoramic view of the financial district, casting long geometric pools of morning sunlight across the massive mahogany table. Jared and Megan sat perfectly upright in their high-backed leather chairs. They projected an aura of triumphant, unshakable confidence, masking the desperate reality of their situation with tailored suits and designer accessories. They had spent the last 3 days living in a state of sustained, agonizing panic, dodging hostile calls from their new penthouse property manager and screening frantic, tearful messages from Arthur Whitmore. But sitting in this pristine room, breathing in the scent of polished wood and expensive coffee, they believed they had finally crossed the finish line. The out-of-state holding company representative sat directly across from them. He was a sharp-suited, aggressive corporate buyer named Vance, who was eager to acquire my downtown commercial building at a significant cash discount. Vance had brought his own legal counsel, completely unaware that he was participating in a massive criminal conspiracy. At the head of the table sat the senior escrow officer, a meticulous woman efficiently organizing the final stacks of transfer documents. The air conditioning hummed a low, steady rhythm. The atmosphere was completely sterile, entirely professional, and thick with impending wealth. Jared reached out and confidently picked up the heavy silver pen provided by the title agency. His hand hovered directly over the signature line of the final closing contract. This single stroke of ink was the ultimate threshold. It was supposed to legally finalize the fraudulent sale, instantly releasing millions of dollars in wired funds directly into their newly opened shielded offshore accounts. Megan watched the polished tip of the pen with hungry, unblinking eyes. Her breathing was shallow and rapid. She believed her absolute salvation was literally seconds away. She believed she had successfully outmaneuvered a retired, ignorant old man, secured her permanent aristocratic status, and generated the exact capital required to save her bankrupt father and stop their own humiliating penthouse eviction. The heavy frosted glass doors of the conference room did not simply open. They swung inward with a violent, synchronized force that shattered the quiet corporate professionalism of the space. I walked directly into the center of the room. Richard Sullivan marched precisely one step behind my right shoulder, carrying a thick, reinforced leather briefcase. 2 imposing private security contractors flanked us, their presence instantly transforming the sterile business environment into a highly hostile tactical zone. They moved with silent military efficiency, immediately taking positions against the back wall and completely blocking the primary exit. The heavy thud of their boots on the hardwood floor echoed like a judge's gavel. I did not look at this corporate buyer. I did not look at his attorney. I did not look at the escrow officer. I locked my eyes entirely on my son. Jared froze. The physical shock was so absolute that his brain seemed to disconnect from his nervous system. The heavy silver pen slipped from his trembling, powerless fingers and clattered loudly against the mahogany wood rolling across the documents. All the color drained from his face in a single catastrophic instant, leaving his skin a sickly, translucent gray. He stared at me with the wide, uncomprehending terror of a man who had just watched a ghost step out of the shadows. Megan physically recoiled in her chair. Her perfectly manicured hands flew to her mouth to stifle a sudden ragged gasp. The arrogant, untouchable facade she had worn like impenetrable armor for the past 48 hours dissolved into pure primal panic. They had fundamentally believed I was sitting in my suburban home completely defeated and entirely ignorant of their electronic forgery. They had assumed I was powerless to stop the automated machinery of the county registry. My physical presence in this highly secure corporate sanctuary was an absolute terrifying impossibility in their minds. The escrow officer stood up abruptly, her expression caught between profound confusion and rapidly rising alarm. She demanded to know who we were and reached for the telephone console, threatening to summon building security. Richard Sullivan stepped forward before her hand could touch the receiver. He projected the absolute crushing weight of a senior corporate litigator. He did not raise his voice, but he spoke with a cold, surgical precision that instantly commanded the entire room. Sullivan introduced himself formally and introduced me as Tobias Roberts, the sole undisputed and living owner of the commercial property currently sitting on their closing table. He placed his heavy leather briefcase on the polished wood, snapped the brass locks open with a sharp click, and extracted a thick stack of certified, watermarked legal documents. He spread them out directly over Jared's fraudulent contracts, entirely covering the signature lines. Sullivan turned his attention directly to Vance and his corporate attorney. He informed Vance that he was currently sitting at a table with two desperate individuals attempting to execute a multi-million-dollar federal wire fraud. Sullivan pointed a steady finger at the electronic deed Jared had submitted. He stated with absolute undeniable clarity that the document in their possession was a gross calculated forgery. He systematically dismantled their delusion, revealing that my legal team had successfully intercepted the digital transfer at the county level days ago. He explained that the State Fraud Division had deliberately allowed the document to process into the system strictly to cement the felony charges. Sullivan leaned over the table, staring directly at the buyer. He warned Vance that if his holding company authorized the transfer of a single dollar into Jared's accounts, they would be immediately implicated in a federal racketeering investigation. He guaranteed that the funds would be seized by federal authorities under money laundering statutes, and Vance himself would face severe criminal liability for participating in the transaction after being formally notified of the fraud. Vance pushed his heavy chair back from the table as if the documents themselves were highly radioactive. His corporate eagerness vanished instantly, replaced by an intense, overwhelming instinct for self-preservation. He looked at Jared with profound, unshielded disgust. Vance was a ruthless businessman, but he was not a criminal, and he certainly was not going to risk federal prison for a discounted commercial building. He abruptly ordered his attorney to pack their briefcases. He looked at the escrow officer and formally announced that his holding company was permanently withdrawing their purchase offer, effective immediately. The escrow officer was visibly shaking. She looked down at the genuine, irrevocable trust documents Sullivan had provided. The intricate legal seals, the verified signature stamps, and the embedded security watermarks proved beyond any shadow of a legal doubt that the building belonged entirely to me in perpetuity. The documents explicitly prohibited any sale, transfer, or encumbrance without my physical presence and direct notarized authorization. She looked back at the forged electronic deed Jared had submitted and instantly recognized the catastrophic legal liability sitting in her office. She acted with the swift, ruthless efficiency of someone desperately protecting their professional license and their freedom. She reached across the mahogany table and physically snatched the closing contracts away from Jared. She announced in a trembling voice that the transaction was officially halted, the escrow account was permanently frozen, and she would be immediately contacting her internal legal compliance department and the state authorities to report the fraudulent submission. Jared remained completely paralyzed. He did not attempt to defend himself. He did not yell, argue, or deny the accusations. He sat frozen in his high-backed leather chair, his chest rising and falling with shallow, rapid breaths. Sweat began to bead on his forehead. The elaborate, towering structure of his criminal conspiracy had just collapsed directly on top of his head in less than 3 minutes. The millions of dollars he believed were seconds away from his bank account had evaporated into thin air. The luxury penthouse he had recklessly leased was now an impossible financial anchor guaranteeing his imminent humiliating eviction. He had forged federal documents, committed severe felonies, and permanently destroyed his entire existence, all for a massive payout that never actually existed. Megan stared at the empty space on the table where the closing contracts had been just moments before. Her eyes were vacant. Her breathing accelerated into a silent, hyperventilating panic. The absolute reality of their destitution was finally breaking through her psychological armor. She realized her bankrupt parents would receive no salvation, and she was now firmly shackled to a man facing imminent federal indictment. I stood at the end of the mahogany table, flanked by my attorney and my security detail, watching the total, irreversible destruction of their future. I looked down at my son, observing the sheer magnitude of his failure. I did not feel a single drop of pity. I had provided the rope, and they had eagerly, arrogantly tied their own noose. The silence in the conference room was violently broken by the harsh scraping sound of heavy chair legs being shoved across the hardwood floor. Arthur Vance stood up, his face flushed with a dark, explosive rage. The corporate composure he had maintained moments ago had completely evaporated. He was a man who dealt in high-stakes acquisitions, a shark accustomed to dominating boardrooms, but he was absolutely terrified of federal racketeering charges. He recognized instantly that Jared had callously attempted to use his holding company as a blind accomplice in a massive wire fraud scheme. Vance slammed his hands flat onto the mahogany table, leaning directly into Jared's personal space. He did not yell, but his voice was a low, vibrating growl of pure hostility. He informed my son that his holding company possessed a legion of corporate litigators who specialized in destroying lives over bad contracts. He promised Jared that long before the federal government finished prosecuting him for forgery, Vance's legal team would file a catastrophic civil suit for fraudulent misrepresentation, breach of contract, and intentional sabotage of corporate assets. He vowed to seize whatever pathetic remnants of cash Jared possessed, liquidate his personal property, and hound him into permanent, inescapable bankruptcy. Vance did not wait for a response. He snatched his briefcase from the floor, barked a sharp command to his attorney, and stormed out of the conference room. The heavy glass doors swung shut behind them, leaving a suffocating, terrifying vacuum in their wake. The escrow officer was already in motion. She swept the genuine trust documents into a secure folder and stepped away from the table, physically distancing herself from the epicenter of the crime. She stated that her legal obligations were clear, and she would remain in the room only long enough to hand her files directly to law enforcement. Jared remained slouched in his chair, staring at the polished wood. The blood had entirely left his face. He was breathing in shallow, rapid gasps, his eyes darting frantically between the escrow officer, Richard Sullivan, and the stack of forged contracts still resting on the table. The absolute reality of his failure finally shattered his cognitive paralysis. He realized that the pieces of paper sitting inches from his hands were the physical manifestations of a federal felony. In a sudden, blind surge of sheer panic, his brain bypassed all logical reasoning. He falsely believed that if he could physically destroy the documents in front of him, he could somehow erase the crime. With a guttural cry, Jared lunged forward across the wide mahogany table. He stretched his arms out, his fingers desperately clawing at the forged warranty deed and the fraudulent escrow agreements. He intended to rip the papers into shreds, to swallow them if necessary, driven by the pure, mindless instinct of a trapped animal trying to chew off its own leg. He did not even manage to touch the paper. The two private security contractors moved with terrifying synchronized speed. They were not standard building guards. They were elite, highly trained professionals who operated with absolute physical efficiency. The contractor on the left stepped forward, seized Jared by the shoulders of his tailored suit, and effortlessly, violently shoved him backward. Jared flew back, crashing hard into his leather chair with enough force to knock the breath from his lungs. The second contractor instantly stepped up to the edge of the table, placing his massive frame directly between my son and the documents. They did not draw weapons or raise their voices. They simply established an impenetrable wall of physical dominance, completely sealing off access to the table and blocking any path to the exit. Richard Sullivan adjusted his cuffs, entirely unfazed by the sudden burst of violence. He looked down at Jared, who was gasping for air and clutching his chest. Sullivan informed my son that his attempt to destroy the paper contracts was a pathetic display of ignorance. He explained with cold, surgical precision that the physical documents were entirely irrelevant. The actual crime had been cemented the exact second Jared electronically submitted the forged digital file through the county clerk's portal using a registered IP address. The Federal Registry had automatically logged the time, the location, and the specific digital signature stamps Jared had purchased. The digital footprint was immutable, permanent, and currently sitting on a server in the district attorney's office. Sullivan then delivered the final crushing blow. He stated that my classified fraud alert had operated in tandem with a direct line to the authorities. The moment the county clerk verified the signature mismatch yesterday morning, a formal criminal complaint had been automatically generated. Sullivan calmly checked his watch and announced that local law enforcement, accompanied by federal investigators from the Financial Crimes Division, had been dispatched 20 minutes ago. They were currently establishing a perimeter around the title company building. There was no escape, no negotiation, and absolutely no way out. Megan had been sitting completely still, pressed hard against the back of her chair. She was calculating the variables of her destruction at lightning speed. She heard the words federal investigators and money laundering. She saw the absolute uncompromising trap closing around them. Her survival instinct, honed by years of manipulating her way through high society, completely overrode any shred of loyalty or marital devotion she possessed. Megan stood up slowly, her movements deliberate and highly calculated. She took 2 distinct steps away from Jared, physically segregating herself from him in the eyes of the room. She smoothed the front of her expensive dress, took a deep, shuddering breath, and executed a flawless, sociopathic pivot. She turned her gaze to Richard Sullivan and the escrow officer. Tears immediately welled in her eyes, spilling over her perfectly applied makeup in a display of profound manufactured terror. She pointed a trembling finger directly at her husband. She screamed that she had absolutely no idea what was happening. Her voice echoed off the glass walls, vibrating with synthetic hysteria. She swore to the room that Jared had acted entirely alone. She claimed she was just a supportive wife who had trusted her husband's financial acumen. She fabricated a desperate narrative on the spot, insisting that Jared had been highly secretive, controlling, and verbally aggressive whenever she asked about the commercial property. She stated that he had assured her he possessed a fully legal notarized power of attorney granted by his father. She swore on her life that she had never seen the forged documents, had never participated in the electronic filing, and was completely entirely innocent of the conspiracy. She painted Jared as a manipulative monster who had dragged her blindly into a federal crime to cover his own failures. Jared stared at his wife. The physical impact of the security guard throwing him into his chair was nothing compared to the violent shock of Megan's betrayal. His jaw went slack. He looked at the woman he had sacrificed his family, his morals, and his freedom to impress, watching her expertly offer him up to the federal authorities as a sacrificial lamb to ensure her own survival. I stood silently observing the masterful performance. Megan was brilliant. In any other room with any other audience, her desperate, tearful plea of ignorance might have been enough to secure her immunity. She might have successfully convinced a jury that she was a victim of her husband's ambition. I reached into the inner pocket of my suit jacket and withdrew my smartphone. I did not say a word. I unlocked the screen, opened the encrypted media file I had downloaded from the family cloud server, and maximized the volume. I placed the phone flat on the polished mahogany table right next to the forged documents and pressed play. The audio began with the distinct heavy sound of 2 car doors slamming shut. The confined acoustics of the vehicle were crystal clear in the silent conference room. Jared's recorded voice emerged first, vibrating with panic, stating that filing a forged property deed electronically was a severe felony. Then Megan's voice filled the room. It was not the tearful, helpless voice of the victim she was currently playing. It was the hard, venomous, utterly ruthless voice of the true architect of the crime. The recording broadcasted her demanding tone with flawless clarity. "If you do not file that document tonight, you are going to prison anyway for the preliminary wire fraud," the recorded Megan snapped. "We are already standing over the edge of the cliff. We have to jump. We file the deed electronically tonight. The county clerk's automated system processes the transfer by tomorrow morning. The commercial property legally shifts into your name. We immediately finalize the sale to the holding company, extract, the millions pay off the shadow lenders, and disappear." I tapped the screen, pausing the audio. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of total, inescapable ruin. Megan stood frozen, her arms still half raised in her theatrical gesture of accusation. Her tearful expression dissolved into a mask of pure, unadulterated horror. Her own voice had just provided the federal government with undeniable, indisputable evidence of premeditation, conspiracy, and active instruction to commit wire fraud. She was completely legally chained to the crime. There was no defense attorney on earth capable of explaining away that recording. Jared let out a hollow, broken sound, a pathetic mixture of a laugh and a sob, realizing that the woman who had just tried to destroy him had destroyed herself in the process. I looked through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Down on the street level, directly outside the main entrance of the title company, a convoy of black tactical vehicles and marked police cruisers swung aggressively into the loading zone. Heavy doors opened, and armed officers began pouring onto the pavement. The reflection of flashing red and blue lights began to pulse rhythmically against the glass walls of our conference room, casting long, sweeping shadows over my son and his fraudulent wife. The authorities had arrived. The heavy frosted glass doors of the conference room did not simply open. They were pulled wide with the commanding authoritative force of law enforcement executing a federal warrant. 4 officers breached the room, moving with practiced tactical precision that instantly suffocated any remaining air in the space. 2 local police officers in heavy tactical gear immediately secured the perimeter, physically blocking the primary exit and taking up positions against the glass walls. 2 plainclothes agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation stepped directly toward the center of the mahogany table, their gold shields gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights. The sterile corporate sanctuary of the title company had been transformed into a cold, unforgiving theater of criminal justice. The lead FBI agent did not raise his voice, but his command was absolute and unyielding. He instructed Jared and Megan to step away from the table, keep their hands visible, and place them behind their backs. Megan resisted for a fraction of a second. Her aristocratic pride, fueled by a lifetime of entitlement, refused to accept the reality of her physical subjugation. An officer firmly seized her arm, spinning her around and snapping cold, heavy steel handcuffs around her delicate wrists. The sharp metallic click echoed violently across the quiet room. She gasped a ragged intake of breath as the cold metal bit into her skin. Her designer dress and immaculate styling were instantly reduced to a mocking contrast against the brutal reality of her physical restraint. Jared did not resist. His legs simply gave out. An officer had to physically haul him up by the armpits to prevent him from collapsing entirely onto the polished hardwood floor. As the handcuffs secured his wrists, the last remaining shred of his arrogant delusion shattered into dust. He began to weep. It was not a quiet, dignified sorrow. It was the loud, jagged, hyperventilating sobbing of a terrified child who suddenly realized the fire he started was going to burn him alive. He looked across the room at me, his face slick with sweat and tears, his eyes wide with blind panic. He begged me to stop them. He screamed that I was his father, that I could not let federal agents take him away in chains. He promised frantically to rip up the forged contracts, to cancel the penthouse lease, to walk away, and never ask me for another dime as long as he lived. He offered empty, desperate promises, completely failing to understand the sheer magnitude of the mechanism he had triggered. He believed this was a family dispute that could be resolved with an apology. I looked at him with absolute, unforgiving detachment. I explained that he was operating under a fundamental, catastrophic misunderstanding of the law. I told him that I was not pressing charges. I had no power here. The exact second he forged a digital signature and transmitted a fraudulent commercial deed across state lines through a county server, he committed a severe federal offense. I explained that the United States government was now the sole prosecuting entity. I had absolutely zero power to stop a federal indictment, even if I possessed the desire to do so. The federal agents were not standing in this room as a favor to me. They were there to protect the integrity of the financial system from a calculated multi-million-dollar wire fraud conspiracy. The boulder was rolling down the mountain, and Jared had strapped himself directly to its path. Vance, the corporate buyer, watched the scene unfold with thinly veiled disgust. His attorney rapidly took notes, ensuring their holding company was entirely legally distanced from the crime scene. The escrow officer stood frozen against the back wall, clutching her files to her chest as if they were a physical shield protecting her from the fallout. They were witnessing the catastrophic, humiliating end of a criminal enterprise. The lead FBI agent began reciting their Miranda rights in a flat, monotone voice. The words washed over Jared and Megan, cementing their new, inescapable reality. They had the right to remain silent. Anything they said could and would be used against them in a court of law. Megan stared blankly at the audio recorder still sitting on the mahogany table. She realized with crushing, undeniable clarity that her own arrogant, demanding voice had just provided the federal prosecutor with an unbreakable case. Her desperate attempt to throw Jared under the bus had backfired completely. The officers began to maneuver them toward the door. Jared stumbled, his knees weak and buckling, while Megan held her head down, desperately trying to hide her face behind her disheveled hair. We followed them out of the conference room, moving steadily through the pristine marble-lined lobby of the title company. Dozens of employees and clients stopped their conversations, staring in stunned, dead silence as the wealthy, polished couple was paraded through the building in steel cuffs. It was a walk of absolute public ruin. As the automatic glass doors slid open to the glaring sunlight of the street level, a silver luxury sedan pulled abruptly into the loading zone directly behind the parked police cruisers. Arthur and Eleanor Whitmore stepped out of the vehicle. They were dressed in impeccable country club attire, their faces glowing with arrogant anticipation. They had driven downtown, fully expecting to walk into the title office, greet their victorious daughter, and collect a massive life-saving cashier's check to instantly wipe out their hidden, suffocating bankruptcy. Instead, Arthur Whitmore froze on the concrete pavement. He watched in absolute paralyzed horror as an armed police officer placed a heavy hand on top of his daughter's head and forcefully shoved her into the caged back seat of a marked federal patrol car. The heavy doors of the police cruisers slammed shut with a sickening thud. The sirens chirped a brief, sharp warning to clear the intersection, and the convoy accelerated away from the curb, merging seamlessly into the heavy downtown traffic. Jared and Megan were gone, swallowed entirely by the federal justice system. I stepped out onto the sunlit pavement, slowly buttoning my suit jacket. Richard Sullivan walked calmly beside me, clutching his reinforced leather briefcase. My private security contractors fanned out instinctively, maintaining a secure perimeter around us. Arthur Whitmore remained frozen on the concrete, his face rapidly turning a dangerous, volatile shade of crimson. The initial shock of seeing his daughter arrested evaporated in an instant, replaced by a blind, explosive fury. He spotted me standing near the entrance of the building and charged forward, his fists clenched tightly at his sides. Eleanor Whitmore trailed behind him, her manicured hands covering her mouth in a state of sustained shock. Arthur closed the distance rapidly, stopping just inches from the invisible barrier created by my security detail. He screamed that this was an absolute outrage and illegal targeted harassment of his family. He pointed a trembling manicured finger directly at my chest, his voice echoing loudly across the busy financial district. He threatened to deploy his vast army of corporate litigators. He promised to file catastrophic civil lawsuits for false imprisonment, malicious prosecution, and severe emotional distress. He swore he would contact his powerful allies in the local press and orchestrate a massive, relentless smear campaign that would ruin my reputation and drain every single dollar from my retirement accounts. He was screaming at a retired steelworker. He genuinely believed I was a vulnerable, ignorant old man who had somehow stumbled into a lucky bureaucratic loophole. He believed his sheer volume, his tailored suit, and his fading country club pedigree would intimidate me into absolute submission. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I simply raised a single hand, signaling my security contractors to step back and allow him to finish his frantic, pathetic tirade. I stood perfectly still, letting the hot sun beat down on the pavement, watching a man desperately trying to project power he no longer possessed. When he finally ran out of breath, his chest heaving and spit flying from his lips, I reached smoothly into the inner breast pocket of my suit jacket. I withdrew a thick, heavy legal envelope made of rigid parchment. I extended my arm and pressed the envelope directly against Arthur Whitmore's chest, forcing him to either take it or let it fall to the pavement. He grabbed it instinctively, looking down at the stark legal seal stamped across the front of the paper. I spoke with the cold, measured rhythm of a metronome. I informed him that I was intimately aware of his true financial reality. I detailed the precise, humiliating mechanics of his hidden ruin. I explained that I knew he had been dodging aggressive creditors for over 14 months. I knew he had secretly defaulted on the massive, suffocating mortgage attached to his sprawling estate while continuing to host lavish, expensive dinners at his exclusive country club. I knew his entire aristocratic existence was a hollow, rotting shell built entirely on unsecured debt and phantom equity. Arthur stared at me, his eyes widening in pure, unadulterated terror. His loud threats of lawsuits and press campaigns died instantly in his throat. I watched the realization hit him like a physical blow. I explained that my holding company, Apex Vanguard, specialized in acquiring distressed premium debt portfolios. 6 days ago, recognizing the profound financial vulnerability of the Whitmore family, my legal team approached his primary lender. The bank was desperate to offload a toxic, non-performing asset before it triggered an internal audit. I purchased the entire promissory note attached to the Whitmore estate for a fraction of its original value in pure liquid cash. I was no longer his daughter's disposable father-in-law. I was the sole absolute owner of his debt. Eleanor Whitmore let out a sharp, choked sob, collapsing heavily against the side of their leased luxury sedan. Arthur looked down at the envelope in his hands, his fingers shaking violently as he traced the outline of the legal seal. He could not speak. The oxygen had been entirely sucked out of his lungs. I did not give him a chance to recover. I delivered the final, irrevocable blow. I informed him that standard foreclosure proceedings usually permitted a 90-day grace period to vacate the premises. However, because his specific debt portfolio was directly tied to the fraudulent commercial transfer his daughter had just attempted to execute, my legal counsel had triggered an immediate emergency acceleration clause based on criminal liability. The standard eviction timeline was entirely void. I looked Arthur Whitmore directly in the eyes and watched his fragile ego completely shatter. I told him he had exactly 48 hours to pack whatever pathetic remnants of his life he could fit into the trunk of his car and vacate the premises. If he remained on my property one single minute past the deadline, armed sheriff's deputies would arrive to physically drag him out the front door and throw his belongings onto the street. The illusion was dead. The Whitmore empire had officially collapsed into dust. I left the financial district behind, the flashing red and blue lights of the federal cruisers fading into the rearview mirror of Sullivan's vehicle. The silence of my suburban home that evening was profound and absolute. It was the deep, settling quiet that follows a massive structural collapse. I walked into my kitchen, poured a single glass of cold water, and stood looking out the window at the darkening street. I had spent the last 2 years absorbing constant humiliation, playing the role of the ignorant, disposable old man, while my son and his wife actively plotted my financial execution. Now the elaborate fantasy they had constructed was entirely dead, replaced by the crushing machinery of the federal justice system. The shrill, sudden ringing of the landline shattered the quiet of the house. I did not move immediately. I let the mechanical sound echo against the tile walls, knowing exactly who was on the other end of the connection. I slowly placed my glass on the granite counter and picked up the receiver. An automated, pre-recorded voice filled the line, stating that I was receiving a collect call from an inmate at the county correctional facility. The system prompted me to press 1 to accept the charges. I pressed the button, listening to the brief electronic click that connected my quiet kitchen to the grim concrete reality of a holding cell. Jared did not wait for me to speak. His voice erupted through the speaker, frantic, ragged, and completely stripped of the arrogant corporate polish he wore like a second skin. Dad, please do not hang up." He was weeping. It was not a quiet, dignified sorrow. It was the loud, hyperventilating panic of a man who had suddenly realized he was drowning. I could hear the chaotic background noise of the county jail behind him, the echoing shouts of inmates, the heavy clanking of steel doors, and the harsh, sterile hum of an environment designed to strip away human dignity. Jared was trapped in a nightmare he had built with his own 2 hands. "They put me in a holding cell with 30 other men, Dad," Jared sobbed, his breath hitching violently. "It smells like ammonia and sweat. I have been sitting on a concrete floor for 8 hours. The federal magistrate denied my standard processing. They labeled me an extreme flight risk because of the offshore accounts Megan set up. They set my bail at $2 million. I need 10% to secure a bond. I need $200,000 wired tonight, or they are going to transfer me to the maximum security federal block by tomorrow morning. You have the money, you own the building, you have to bail me out right now." He was still giving orders. Even from the bottom of a federal holding cell, the entitlement was so deeply ingrained in his psychology that he genuinely expected me to act as his personal bank. I leaned against the kitchen counter, my expression entirely unreadable in the dim light. I did not feel a single surge of paternal panic. I felt a cold, surgical clarity. Why would I authorize a wire transfer to release a man who just attempted to steal my entire livelihood, Jared? I asked. My voice was perfectly flat, completely devoid of empathy. "It was Megan!" Jared screamed into the receiver, his voice cracking with desperation. He abandoned his wife with terrifying speed, entirely willing to serve her up to save himself. She manipulated everything. She was the one who found the offshore banking contacts. She hired the digital forger who bypassed the county clerk's portal. She told me that if I did not secure the commercial building, she would leave me. She threatened to go to her father and have me blacklisted from the financial sector. I was trapped. I was just trying to save my marriage. She brainwashed me into doing this. You have to believe me. I am a victim here. I closed my eyes, letting out a slow, measured sigh. His cowardice was absolute. He was a grown man shifting the blame for a federal felony onto his spouse because he lacked the fundamental spine to own his failure. "You are not a victim of Megan's ambition, Jared. I stated, my tone dropping to a low, unforgiving register. You are a victim of my leniency. The line went silent for a fraction of a second, save for the heavy, jagged sound of his breathing. When you were 17 years old, I continued pacing my words with deliberate impact. You took my truck without permission, drove intoxicated, and destroyed the vehicle against a retaining wall. I paid the property owner out of my own pocket to avoid police involvement. When you were 22 and maxed out 3 fraudulent credit cards in college, I liquidated a portion of my retirement fund to keep you out of a civil courtroom. I spent your entire life placing a safety net beneath every tightrope you decided to walk. I believed I was protecting my son. I gripped the edge of the granite counter, confronting my own profound failures as a parent. I was actually teaching you that actions do not have consequences, I told him. I taught you that you could destroy property, break the law, and manipulate the system, and your father would always arrive to clean up the wreckage. You forged a federal document and attempted to steal millions of dollars because you fundamentally believed you would never have to pay the price. You looked me in the eye and lied to my face because you thought I was a stupid, disposable old man. I am removing the safety net. I will not wire a single cent to the bail bondsman. You are going to sit in that concrete cell and you are going to face the federal prosecutor on your own. No! Jared shrieked, the sound tearing through the telephone receiver. You cannot do this to me. I will lose everything. The penthouse manager just served us with an emergency eviction notice. We have 72 hours to produce the entire annual lease in cash. If I am in jail, they will throw all my property onto the street. We will have absolutely nowhere to go. You cannot let me become homeless. He was utilizing his final desperate point of leverage. He expected the threat of a homeless son to trigger a primal protective instinct within me. He was entirely unprepared for the reality of the situation. An emergency eviction notice, I repeated, letting the words hang heavily in the air. Did you happen to read the name of the holding company printed at the top of that legal document before the armed guards escorted you out of the lobby? I do not care about the holding company, Jared sobbed frantically. It is some faceless corporate entity called Apex Vanguard. They are ruthless. They refuse to wait for the escrow funds to clear. They do not care that I am facing an indictment. You have to help me fight them. Apex Vanguard is not a faceless corporate entity, Jared, I replied, my voice cutting through his panic like a scalpel. I paused, allowing the absolute silence of my kitchen to stretch across the cellular connection. I wanted him to hear every single syllable of his destruction. Your mother and I established Apex Vanguard 10 years ago using offshore capital, I stated calmly. I am the sole undisputed owner of the Obsidian. I own your penthouse. I personally instructed the senior property manager to reject your fraudulent proof of funds. I personally authorized the armed security detail to serve you with that eviction notice. I am your landlord, Jared. You tried to destroy the very man who was secretly putting a roof over your head. The silence on the other end of the line was absolute. It was the sound of a human mind completely shattering under the weight of catastrophic irony. Jared did not scream. He did not cry. His vocal cords simply ceased to function. He had spent years treating me as a financial stepping stone, entirely oblivious to the fact that he had been living inside my residential empire the entire time. He had desperately sought the approval of his bankrupt father-in-law while completely dismissing the father who held absolute dictatorial power over his reality. I did not offer him a chance to respond. I did not offer any final words of comfort. I simply placed the receiver back onto the cradle, cutting the connection with a sharp, decisive click. The house returned to its profound, settling quiet. The cancer of their manipulation had been entirely excised from my life. The click of the receiver severed the final tie to my son, leaving my kitchen in absolute, unbroken silence. The cancer of his manipulation had been excised. Now the secondary infection required immediate attention. While Jared remained paralyzed by terror in a concrete holding cell, Megan demonstrated the ruthless sociopathic survival instinct that had driven her entire existence. By dawn, she had successfully negotiated her release. She secured a predatory bail bond through a notorious agency operating on the fringes of the city, collateralizing the last remaining limit on a high-tier credit card she had hidden from the federal sweep. She signed a contract with an extortionate interest rate, fully aware she had no legitimate means to repay the debt. She did not care. She walked out of the county jail into the gray morning light, leaving her husband to face the federal indictment completely alone. Megan wasted absolutely no time. She hailed a cab directly to the polished glass offices of the most aggressive family law attorney in the financial district. She immediately filed for an emergency dissolution of marriage. Her strategy was transparent and highly calculated. She intended to aggressively distance herself from Jared's criminal liability, portraying herself as the innocent, manipulated victim of a mastermind fraudster. In her divorce petition, she demanded immediate spousal support, exclusive possession of the luxury penthouse, and exactly 50% of what she believed was a vast marital estate. She was convinced Jared still possessed hidden offshore capital or a secret stake in my commercial holdings. Her delusion was completely dismantled less than 24 hours later. The emergency asset hearing took place in a sterile, windowless courtroom at the county annex. Megan sat beside her expensive attorney, her posture rigid, her face locked in a mask of wounded aristocratic pride. She expected Jared to be dragged into the room in chains. Instead, the heavy wooden doors swung open, and Richard Sullivan walked in alone. He placed his reinforced leather briefcase on the defense table, his expression completely devoid of emotion. Megan's attorney immediately launched into a theatrical tirade demanding access to Jared's accounts to secure his client's financial stability. Sullivan did not interrupt. He waited for the lawyer to finish his aggressive posturing before calmly opening his briefcase and sliding a thick stack of federal documents across the table. Sullivan informed the court that there was absolutely nothing to divide. He explained with surgical precision that the Federal Bureau of Investigation, acting under the authority of the wire fraud statutes, had successfully executed a total asset freeze. Every single bank account, investment portfolio, and liquid asset bearing Jared's name had been completely seized by the federal government pending the criminal trial. Megan's face drained of color. She lunged forward, insisting that she had a legal right to the marital home and the corporate assets. Sullivan did not even look at her. He simply handed the judge the verified deeds and trust documents belonging to Apex Vanguard. He proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that the penthouse, the vehicles, and the commercial holding company were entirely owned by my private trust. Jared possessed zero equity. He was a tenant who had just been legally evicted. Sullivan then delivered the final crushing blow. He produced the financial ledger detailing Jared's actual net worth. Between the pending federal fines, the immediate loss of his corporate salary, and the mountain of unsecured debt he had accumulated trying to impress his wife, Jared's marital estate was entirely negative. He was functionally bankrupt. Sullivan looked directly at Megan and stated that she was legally entitled to absolutely nothing but half of her husband's catastrophic debt, including the predatory bail bond she had just signed. Megan's attorney stared at the federal seizure notices. He realized in a fraction of a second that his client possessed no money to pay his exorbitant retainer. Without a single word of apology, the lawyer snapped his briefcase shut, stood up, and walked out of the courtroom, leaving Megan sitting completely alone at the plaintiff's table. She stared at the wood grain, her entire fabricated universe reduced to ash. Simultaneously, the 48-hour grace period I had granted Arthur and Eleanor Whitmore officially expired. The heavy wrought iron gates of the Whitmore estate were not opened by the butler. They were breached by 3 marked cruisers from the county sheriff's department. Armed deputies stepped onto the pristine cobblestone driveway, executing the accelerated eviction order with absolute uncompromising authority. Arthur Whitmore stood on his grand mahogany porch, his face purple with rage, screaming threats of civil litigation and demanding to call his political allies. The deputies ignored him entirely. They physically escorted him down the marble steps. Eleanor followed, weeping hysterically, clutching a single designer handbag, as the deputies systematically locked the massive front doors and posted the neon foreclosure notices across the glass. Their luxury furniture, their imported art, and their extensive wine collection were legally seized, trapped inside the house to satisfy the massive debt I now owned. The Whitmores were escorted off the property, left standing on the public curb, with nothing but the clothes on their backs and 3 hastily packed suitcases. That evening, a heavy rain began to fall over the city, washing away the last remnants of the day. Megan, stripped of her credit cards and entirely rejected by her high society friends, was forced to seek shelter on the extreme industrial outskirts of the city. She dragged her single suitcase across the cracked, weed-choked asphalt of a cheap, run-down motel. The neon sign above the office flickered violently, casting a sickly red glow over the decaying parking lot. She unlocked the door to a moldy, cramped room, the smell of stale smoke and damp carpet instantly suffocating her. She walked slowly to the grimy window and pushed aside the frayed curtain, looking out into the relentless rain. Parked directly under a flickering street lamp in the corner of the motel lot was a silver luxury sedan. It was the only asset her parents had not yet been forced to surrender. Through the rain-streaked windshield, Megan could see the silhouettes of Arthur and Eleanor Whitmore. The engine was off to conserve gas. They were huddled in the front seats, draped in coats, preparing to spend the night living out of their vehicle. The aristocratic empire they had murdered and manipulated to protect had completely collapsed, leaving them trapped in the cold, inescapable reality of the gutter. The morning sun broke through the heavy overcast sky, casting a sharp, unforgiving light across the glass facade of the obsidian. I stood in the pristine, marble-lined hallway of the top floor, my hands resting comfortably in the pockets of my overcoat. The silence of the luxury corridor was broken by the heavy, chaotic sounds of manual labor. 4 armed sheriff's deputies supervised a crew of professional movers who were systematically dismantling the penthouse Jared and Megan had occupied. I watched with absolute quiet detachment as the physical manifestations of their unchecked greed were hauled out of the double doors. The imported Italian leather sofas, the ridiculous crystal chandeliers, the absurdly expensive modern art they had purchased on phantom credit lines, all of it was shoved onto heavy cargo dollies. The crew did not treat the items with reverence. They treated them as exactly what they were: unpaid liabilities destined for a public auction. The movers rolled the carts past me, heading directly for the freight elevator to dump the lavish facade onto the curb. The heavy wooden door of the adjacent penthouse swung open. A man in a tailored suit stepped out, pausing to watch the chaotic scene. He glanced at the sweating movers, then turned his gaze toward me, taking in my simple overcoat and quiet demeanor. He adjusted his silk tie and asked with mild curiosity if I was the new tenant moving into the vacant unit. I did not turn my head to look at him. I kept my eyes fixed on the empty, echoing space where my son's fraudulent empire used to be. I replied in a calm, steady voice that I was the owner of the building and I was simply taking out the trash. The neighbor blinked, thoroughly unnerved by the absolute coldness in my tone, and quickly retreated to the elevator. By late afternoon, the penthouse was entirely gutted. The physical space had been completely sterilized, stripped bare of the entitlement and betrayal that had infected it. My work in the financial district was officially concluded. I returned to my quiet suburban home as the evening shadows began to stretch across the lawn. The house was peaceful, grounded in decades of honest labor and quiet dignity. I walked into the kitchen, brewed a pot of strong black coffee, and carried a steaming mug out to the back porch. I sat in my old wooden rocking chair, watching the fireflies flicker in the fading light. The air was cool and clean. I reached into my pocket, retrieved my smartphone, and dialed the direct line to Richard Sullivan. He answered on the first ring. I instructed him to completely liquidate the remaining Whitmore debt portfolio and channel the recovered capital directly into a new financial vehicle. I ordered the immediate establishment of a massive educational trust fund dedicated entirely to underprivileged youth within our community. I specified that the scholarships were to be awarded strictly to individuals who demonstrated exceptional work ethic, uncompromising integrity, and a profound understanding of personal responsibility. The millions of dollars Jared and Megan had attempted to steal would instead build actual futures for people who knew the value of an honest dollar. I hung up the phone and took a slow, deep sip of my coffee. The air around me felt lighter. The malignant tumors of greed, manipulation, and entitlement had been surgically removed from my existence. The silent adjustment was absolute, final, and completely irreversible. True power does not announce itself through loud displays of wealth or aggressive posturing. It operates quietly in the background, observing, calculating, and acting only when absolutely necessary. Wealth without character is merely a temporary illusion destined to collapse under the weight of its own arrogance. The greatest inheritance a parent can leave is not financial capital, but the unyielding principles of integrity and personal accountability. When you reward entitlement, you breed destruction. Choose to invest your resources in those who genuinely understand the value of honest labor. Please subscribe to our channel and share your thoughts below with us.